Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into a foggy European morning, right at the edge of the year 1000. One of those uneasy dawns where the air feels thick, the sky is still bruised with leftover night, and you have that odd sense that the world itself is holding its breath. You stand in damp grass, listening to the creak of distant wooden carts and the soft lowing of cattle, and it hits you almost immediately. You probably wouldn't survive this century for more than a week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing the little constellation of night owls across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in that grey pre-dawn, your breath coiling like thin smoke, and Europe around you is a place still recovering from centuries of instability. Historians still argue whether the year 1000 actually felt as ominous to people as later writers claimed, but you can sense a kind of collective shrug in the air, the kind people make when life has already thrown everything at them. They've seen invasions, famine, and enough political confusion to make modern group chats look orderly. Your boots or whatever footwear you can manage from the local cobbler, which is basically a sad leather pouch, sinks slightly into mud as you trudge toward a tiny settlement. It's barely more than a cluster of timber houses tucked between farmland and forest. A rooster crows like it's auditioning for a medieval alarm clock commercial, and a woman steps out of her doorway with a bucket, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who has repeated the same routine 8,000 times. You notice right away how still everything feels. No engines, no background hum of electricity, no Wi-Fi, signals quietly frying your brain. Just the rustle of straw, the distant clack of someone splitting firewood, and the smell of smoke drifting lazily across the village. A historian could tell you that most Europeans lived in rural pockets like this small, insulated worlds, where daily life cycled around seasons, superstition, and a constant low-level hope that nobody raids your settlement this week. A quirky little detail hits you as you wander closer. Many villagers here believe the forest edge is full of spirits, some benevolent, some less so. There's an old log set near the tree line where farmers leave tiny offerings, crumbs, flowers, a carved wooden bird just in case something out there appreciates the gesture. Historians still argue whether these rituals were remnants of earlier pagan traditions or just the medieval equivalent of knocking on wood to keep your anxiety from winning. As the sun finally peaks over the hills, warm light spills onto thatched roofs, lighting up the morning chores like a spotlight on an unpaid cast. You see a man dragging a plough toward the fields with a determination that suggests he's been awake since before you were born. Another villager shuffles past you, carrying a stack of firewood and giving you a suspicious look, because in this world, strangers mean trouble more often than opportunity. You step toward the center of the settlement, where a single well stands like the unofficial water cooler of medieval gossip. Two women are already there, drawing water and murmuring about last night's strange lights in the sky. They gesture upward, wondering aloud if the stars are changing again, or if it's just another sign that the world is about to end. You smile quietly. People have been predicting the apocalypse since before calendars existed. The well stones are slick with moss, and the rope creaks as someone hauls up a bucket. You lean against a post and notice something you didn't expect. Despite the hard living, the endless work, the lack of toothpaste, medieval mornings have their own kind of peaceful rhythm. The houses smoke gently, the animals shift in their pens, and the faint call of a church bell travels over the fields like a reminder that someone, somewhere, is trying to impose order on a chaotic universe. A mainstream historical fact drifts into your thoughts. Around the year 1000, Europe's population is beginning to rise after centuries of turbulence. It will take time, but these quiet villages will slowly grow, fields will expand, and stability will inch forward like a tired animal dragging itself out of a swamp. As you watch a mother braid her daughter's hair, you pick up a fringed tidbit you didn't expect. The child wears a tiny charm made of iron, shaped like a crooked little moon. Her mother swears it keeps nightmares away. Whether it works or not, you admire the confidence. A dog trots past you, a scruffy, uneven creature, with the energy of someone who has seen too much, but it pauses long enough to sniff your hand before deciding you're not edible. A victory. You keep walking. A group of older men sits near a cartwheel they've been repairing, muttering about how this winter will be harsher than the last. One scratches his beard and insists he saw a wolf, the size of a horse, near the woods. Another rolls his eyes so hard you're surprised they don't fall out and become part of the mud. You breathe in the morning air. cool and faintly smoky, and realize that for all its struggles, medieval Europe at the turn of the millennium is a world built on routine, community, repetition, and slow, grinding stability. Nothing happens quickly here. Every improvement takes generations. Every structure takes years. Every habit becomes a tradition simply because people don't have the luxury to overthink alternatives. You adjust your cloak more itchy than warm and walk toward the fields with the farmers as the day officially begins, the sun climbing, the fog lifting, and the 1,000-year journey ahead of you, stretching out like a long, winding road you may or may not be ready for. You follow the farmers out toward the fields, your feet squelching through the damp path that runs like a muddy spine through the heart of the village. The sun is rising now, slow, soft, and a little shy, warming the tops of the thatched roofs and brushing everything in a faint gold that makes the world seem gentler than it actually is. You feel the pull of the countryside around you, the low hum of insects waking, the smell of dew on grass, and the unmistakable aroma of livestock that have never heard the word hygiene. Ahead of you, the landscape opens like a wide, uneven quilt. Patches of farmland stitched together by hedges, fences, and worn footpaths. You trudge alongside a man leading an ox, the animal moving with all the enthusiasm of someone dragged out of bed on their only day off. You can relate. The farmer gives you a nod that says, "You look confused, but at least you're holding a tool, so I guess you're helping. If you lived here, this is what most of your days would look like. Repetition. You'd wake before dawn, shiver through the cold, and head straight to work. You would plant, weed, harvest, repair, haul, or, on really exciting days, chase escaped pigs who have decided to pursue a life of freedom. Medieval Europe is a place where the idea of weekend hasn't evolved yet. Historians still argue whether peasants had more free time than later industrial workers. But looking at the crowd of tired faces trudging toward the fields, you suspect nobody here would describe life as relaxing. A mainstream historical fact drifts through your mind as you walk. Around the year 1000, about 90% of Europe's population lived in rural communities just like this one. Cities are rare, tiny, and often unpleasant, so most people spend their lives tied to the land, bound by feudal obligations that shape every hour of every season. You, as part of this world, would owe taxes to your lord, labor to the manor, and loyalty to pretty much anyone with a sword. You approach the fields, and someone hands you a wooden rake. It's the medieval equivalent of being assigned a chore you never volunteered for. The soil is heavy and dark, still clinging to the night's moisture, and when you try to pull the rake through it, your arms instantly file a formal complaint. A farmer nearby chuckles lightly, warmly, like he's seen many visitors try and fail at basic manual labor. You smile back because you don't want to start your medieval life by offending the one guy who kind of likes you. Around you, villagers work in small groups, often silent but occasionally trading jokes or news. You hear someone gossip about a nearby manor getting a new steward, someone else muttering about the price of grain, and a third insisting that their cow has been giving attitude lately. You're not sure how one to evaluates bovine sass, but you admire the confidence. A quirky tidbit catches your eye. A young boy has tied a handful of feathers to the end of a stick and is waving it above the field before sowing seeds. When you ask why, his mother explains that it keeps mischievous spirits from spoiling the crop. Whether it's an old local belief or just something she invented to keep her kid entertained, you can't tell. Historians still argue whether such rituals were meaningful spiritual acts or simply medieval fidget toys. As the morning moves on, the work settles into a steady rhythm. You rake stones away from the rows while others plant by hand, pushing the seeds gently into the earth. There's no fancy equipment, no modern shortcuts, just repetitive motions and the quiet hope that nature will be kind this year. In the distance, you hear the steady beat of a hammer from the village blacksmith, the occasional bleat of a goat, and the gentle breeze pushing through the wheat like a sighing ocean. One farmer, an older man with a face carved by sun and time, explains that last year's harvest was decent but not great. A late frost nipped the early seedlings, and a stretch of drought followed. He shrugs as he works, telling you that the land has moods, and sometimes it simply decides not to cooperate. You nod along as if you also have regular conversations with fields. Around midday, you all pause for a meal, not a feast, but a modest collection of bread, cheese, and a thin onion soup that tastes better than it looks. You sit on the edge of a field, legs tired, back complaining, but the air around you is peaceful. Birds flit overhead, landing on fence posts, and a couple of children run past, chasing each other, laughter cutting through the stillness like bells. You overhear a debate between two farmers about whether wolves have been getting closer to the village lately. One swears he saw glowing eyes in the woods last night. The other insists it was probably just a cat, with ambitions. They both look at you as if you might break the tie, but you keep eating your bread like a neutral foreign diplomat. You learn another historical reality here. The rhythm of seasons decides everything. Spring is planting, summer is maintenance, autumn is harvest, and winter is try not to die. There's no romantic countryside aesthetic here, no cozy horseback rides, no baskets of flowers, no medieval picnics under oak trees. Just the work, the land, and the hope that nothing catastrophic arrives this year to ruin the fragile balance of survival. As the sun drifts toward afternoon, the mood shifts slightly. A breeze picks up, clouds gather, someone worries about rain, another mutters that his joints predict a storm. Historians still argue whether medieval people were genuinely able to forecast weather better than we can today, or whether they simply made very confident guesses. You keep working until the sky darkens just a touch. Not enough to scare anyone, but enough to remind you that medieval life always has a watchful eye on nature. People here live close to the earth, close to cycles, close to unpredictability. In a world without meteorology, insurance, or reliable food storage, every day is a negotiation with fate. By the time the villagers begin to pack up tools, your arms feel like overcooked noodles. You're tired, sore, and a little proud you survived your first half day without being run over by an ox. As you trudge back toward the village, the fields behind you ripple gently in the wind, quiet, patient, ancient, and you realize you've just walked through the heartbeat of medieval Europe, steady, unglamorous, and endlessly repeating. You follow the villagers back toward the cluster of houses, your boots heavy with mud and your arms doing that trembly thing they do when they've been asked to perform tasks they never agreed to. As you walk, the layout of the community becomes clearer, the neat little lines of obligation, stitched invisibly between the people, the land, and, most importantly, the Lord who technically owns every patch of earth your feet have touched today. You reach the village clearing just as a horn sounds low, slow, and unmistakably official. The kind of sound that says, "Everyone gather so we can remind you who's actually in charge." A crowd starts drifting toward the manor courtyard. Some walk, some trudge, a few fuss with their clothes in the strained hope of looking respectable. You join them, blending into the slow-moving tide of people about to renew the ancient dance of loyalty and labor. Before you stands the manor house, part administrative center, part home, part please don't raid us symbol. It's not a castle, not yet, more like a fortified farmhouse with attitude. The wooden beams are thick, the walls slightly slanted, and the small tower peeks up like it's trying to convince itself it's important. Smoke curls from the chimney in lazy ribbons. As everyone settles, the steward steps forward, thin, sharp-featured, with the weary energy of someone who has memorized too many rules. He holds a scroll, as if it weighs as much as a sword. He clears his throat dramatically, which is either a power move or a sign he's been practicing this speech all morning. He begins reciting the terms of feudal obligation. Who owes what, when they owe it, and how much of their harvest belongs to the Lord. Around you, villagers nod not happily, but resignedly, like commuters listening to train delay announcements. You catch snippets. 2 days of labor each week on Lord's demesnes. Tithe to the church still required. Additional levy in times of conflict. Feudalism, in all its complexity, unfolds before you. You start to understand why historians still argue whether it was a clever system of mutual obligation or just an elaborate excuse for the upper class to enjoy nicer bread. A mainstream historical fact drifts through your mind. Across much of medieval Europe, society was organized through layers of oaths. Lords swore loyalty to higher nobles, who swore loyalty to kings, who swore loyalty to God, who never signed anything back but was assumed to approve. At the bottom, peasants like you were tied to the land in arrangements that made modern employment contracts look like spa brochures. As the steward drones on, your eyes wander. You notice the men-at-arms standing near the manor door, chainmail gleaming, spears upright, helmets slightly too big for some of them. One younger guard shifts his weight nervously, probably still learning how to look intimidating without wobbling. Another stands confidently, arms crossed, radiating the energy of someone who enjoys telling people no at doorways. Then you see the Lord himself emerge, a middle-aged man with broad shoulders, a trimmed beard, and the tired posture of someone who must constantly balance real danger with maintaining the appearance of authority. His cloak rustles in the breeze, burgundy and heavy, embroidered with a crest featuring a rampant lion that looks both noble and extremely confused. The Lord raises his hand, and everyone bows slightly. Even the children attempt half-hearted curtsies before returning to whatever dirt game they were inventing. He speaks not unkindly, but with the firm confidence of someone who knows he's the only person here who could command soldiers or build walls. He addresses concerns about wolves, upcoming harvest predictions, and rumors of distant bandits. But you notice something subtle beneath his words. He depends on these people as much as they depend on him. That's the core of the system you're standing in. Oaths go both ways. You give labor and loyalty. He gives protection and justice. Ideally, a quirky tidbit drifts in from a hushed conversation between two older women. Apparently, the Lord refuses to eat apples unless they've been cut into perfect slices by his cook, because last winter he saw a worm inside one and declared it a bad omen. Since then, every apple on the estate has been inspected like it's applying for a job. Historians still argue whether lords actually believed such omens, or whether they simply enjoyed the luxury of being picky in a world where everyone else ate whatever they could find. As the gathering continues, a tense moment interrupts the calm. A farmer steps forward to complain about a boundary dispute. Something about his neighbor's pig stealing into his garden and eating what he claims was the sweetest cabbage he's ever grown. The steward sighs as if he handles 10 pig-based crimes every week. The Lord hears the case with patience, then orders the pig's owner to repair the fence and repay the cabbage in kind. The villagers nod approvingly, impressed by the fairness. You nod too, mostly because you're afraid not to. As the session winds down, you take in the world around you, horses stamping, the ground near the stables, chickens pecking obliviously at crumbs, peasants stretching their sore backs, guards shifting their grips on spears. Everything here is woven into a structure that's equal parts practical and fragile. You realize that, for all the hardship, there's a certain comfort in the predictability of feudal life. Everyone knows their place. Everyone knows their role. You serve the land feeds you, the Lord protects you, and the entire system continues like a slow-moving wheel. But you also sense how easily everything could break. One bad harvest, one small conflict, one ambitious rival lord, one pack of wolves that actually is the size of horses. By the time the meeting ends, the sun is higher, the villagers are dispersing, and the weight of medieval obligations sits firmly on your shoulders. You walk a few steps behind the others, letting the breeze cool your face as you watch the Lord retreat into his manor, which suddenly looks much stronger, taller, and more complicated than it did a few hours ago. The feudal world hums around you, steady and ancient, and you step deeper into its intricate web, knowing your journey has only just begun. You leave the manor grounds with the rest of the villagers, but your eyes keep drifting toward the horizon, toward that rising silhouette of stone and timber perched on a nearby hill. At first glance, it looks almost out of place, like a child tried to stack rocks too high and accidentally created a fortress. But as you walk the winding path upward, the shape grows clearer, firmer, and undeniably intentional. You're heading toward the early medieval castle, and castle is generous. This is not the sleek stone masterpiece you see in movies, where clean white towers sparkle like someone invented power washing centuries early. What you're approaching is a work in progress, a fortress that hasn't quite decided what it wants to be yet. Timber palisades surround the outer yard. A motte rises at the center, topped by a wooden keep that looks both imposing and slightly terrified of strong winds. As you climb, villagers step aside for a small group of laborers hauling stone blocks. The blocks are so heavy the men lean at angles that look medically unsafe. You overhear one muttering a complaint that medieval HR departments definitely wouldn't want written down. Another tells him to be grateful it's stone this time and not timber, because at least stones don't get splinters. Practical optimism. You reach the bailey, the open courtyard, and take in the flurry of movement. Chickens scratch in the dirt. A blacksmith hammers a horseshoe with the confidence of someone who has spent years trying not to accidentally hit his own thumb. Young pages run messages between buildings with the kind of speed usually reserved for people late to school. And soldiers drill in formation, their boots thudding rhythmically on the packed earth. A mainstream historical fact settles into your thoughts. Around the 11th century, wooden fortifications like this were common across Europe. especially after waves of invasions earlier in the Middle Ages. Castles weren't romantic symbols, they were practical panic shelters. If raiders appeared, everyone sprinted uphill into the relative safety of these walls. Historians still argue whether these early mottes grew from local innovation or from the influence of Norman designs spreading across France and beyond. Either way, they become the backbone of medieval defense. You wander toward the keep, passing a stack of rough-hewn planks. A young carpenter wipes sweat from his forehead and nods at you before returning to his task, shaping boards for a new section of walkway. His hands move with that calm precision you've started to notice everywhere in this world. The kind that comes from repeating a craft so many times your muscles know it better than your brain. A quirky tidbit drifts into your ear as you pass two guards. Apparently, the Lord insists all Newcastle workers must greet his favourite hunting dog before starting their duties. The dog, a massive mastiff currently napping in a patch of shade, seems blissfully unaware of its diplomatic responsibilities. The gates creak behind you as a merchant arrives with a wagon full of nails, charcoal, and something wrapped carefully in cloth. You pause, curious. When he pulls the cloth back, you see a set of iron hinges heavier and more ornate than anything else in the courtyard. The steward inspects them with the same focus modern people use when evaluating new smartphones. Approved. You walk along the wooden wall, feeling the rough texture beneath your fingers, and realize just how exposed everything remains. The wood is sturdy, yes, but one spark, one lightning strike, one careless cook, and the whole structure could go up like a medieval birthday candle. You remember hearing stories of many castles burning at least once in their early years. Inside the keep, you find a cool dimness that feels almost luxurious. The walls are thick, the windows narrow slits designed for archers, and the air smells faintly of wax and old wood. A tapestry hangs lopsided on one wall, depicting a lion that looks more like a confused, oversized cat. You run your hand along a table covered in rolled maps and charcoal sketches. One drawing shows the future plan for this hill. Stone curtain walls replacing timber, towers rising at each corner, and the wooden keep replaced by a stone donjon tall enough to see threats hours before they arrive. It's ambitious, borderline optimistic, but you admire the confidence. Medieval builders dream big, even when their tools are small. Down in the armory, a man sharpens blades with a steady rasp, rasp, rasp that echoes softly. He nods to you, then gestures toward a rack of weapons. Spears, axes, swords that look far too heavy for casual use. When he offers you a practice blade, you lift it and immediately regret all your life choices. It weighs about the same as your entire weekly emotional baggage, he chuckles. Takes years, he says. You nod, pretending this was absolutely your issue and not a total. The lack of upper body strength. Outside again, the wind picks up, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding forest. You climb the wooden stairs to the walkway along the palisade. From up here, the view is breathtaking. You see the village spread across the fields like a handful of tiny toys. Beyond that, rolling farmland stretches until it meets the dark smudge of forest, a place full of both firewood and folklore. You stand there, absorbing the calm. Despite the noise below, the world feels strangely still. You understand why people look up to their castles in a literal and symbolic sense. These structures aren't just fortifications, they're promises. Promises that someone will stand watch. That danger will be met with walls, warriors, and warning bells. That life, however fragile, has a protector. Historians still argue whether these early castles were mostly military installations or centers of local governance. But as you watch a steward argue with a guard about storing grain in the wrong shed, you realize it's both. Everything here is both. Safe and dangerous. Strong and vulnerable. Temporary and surprisingly permanent. You make your way down the stairs, passing the mastiff who finally wakes, stretches grandly, and sniffs your cloak in approval. A small honor. You bow slightly. You don't want to offend the only creature here who definitely outranks you socially. As workers haul another load of stone up the hill, you step out of the castle gates, knowing these walls will rise higher each year, slowly transforming this hill into a powerful stone guardian of the countryside. And as you walk back toward the village, you feel the weight of that transformation settling across the land, quiet, steady, inevitable. You follow the path away from the half-built castle, letting the wind push at your cloak as you head toward a quieter part of the landscape. The noise of hammers and shouted orders fades behind you, replaced by the soft chorus of birds and the gentle rustle of leaves brushing against one another. Ahead rises a stone structure not imposing like the castle, not bustling like the village, but serene, self-contained, and humming with its own quiet authority. The abbey. It sits slightly apart from the world, perched on a gentle slope where the first light of morning always hits its walls. Some abbeys do that intentionally positioned to catch the sunrise, as if racing the day to be the first awake. You approach the arched entrance, where a simple wooden door stands open, inviting you into a world ruled not by swords or ploughs, but by bells, books, and the stubborn consistency of discipline. As you step inside, the temperature drops a little, the air becoming cooler, drier, and gently perfumed with candle wax and old wood. Your footsteps echo in the hall, a soft tap-tap that sounds like you're tiptoeing through time. Monks move quietly through the corridors, robes brushing lightly against stone, their faces calm in that, "I woke up at 3 a.m. and somehow don't hate the universe" way. A mainstream historical fact floats into your mind. Monasteries in medieval Europe were the engines of knowledge preservation. When war, famine, and political chaos tore through the continent, these quiet communities copied manuscripts, stored charters, and kept the fragile thread of literacy alive. You're standing in one of the medieval world's few anchors that don't shift with every passing century. A monk carrying a wooden tray nods respectfully as he passes you. On the tray are quills, tiny ink pots, and scraps of vellum, likely poetry drafts, theological notes, or, if he's feeling rebellious, a grocery list disguised as a psalm. The abbey's scriptorium is your next stop. You push the heavy door open gently, half expecting it to creak like in every movie, but it moves smoothly because monks actually maintain their hinges, a shocking innovation for the era. Inside, the glow of sunlight filters through narrow windows, illuminating desks arranged in neat, disciplined rows. At each desk sits a monk hunched over parchment, working with a level of concentration usually reserved for surgeons or people trying to assemble IKEA furniture without instructions. Quills scratch softly, rhythmically, like a tiny feathered rainstorm. Historians still argue whether medieval scribes were universally patient or whether they occasionally muttered unholy words when they spilled ink on a nearly finished page. You suspect the latter. One monk near you is working on an illuminated initial letter, an enormous bee bursting with vines, flowers, and a tiny lizard with impeccable posture. He's been painting the same curve for at least 10 minutes. You admire his endurance. A quirky tidbit floats over from a conversation at the far end of the room. Apparently, last week, a mouse chewed through the corner of a manuscript. Instead of panicking, the monk drew a tiny illustrated mouse in the margin and wrote a stern note addressing it directly. Medieval creativity thrives under duress. You wander deeper into the abbey, following a soft chant that drifts from the chapel like a warm breeze. The sound vibrates gently in your chest, low, steady, almost hypnotic. Monks stand in rows, heads bowed, voices weaving into a unified hum that feels older than stone itself. You slip into the back, letting the cadence settle around you. It's the kind of controlled monotony that makes your eyelids feel heavy, like they're being gently pulled towards sleep. But discipline is the backbone here. A bell rings, and the chant ends abruptly as if someone pressed pause on a celestial playlist. The monks file out in orderly lines. You join the flow, walking through the cloister garden where herbs grow in neatly arranged beds. Mint, sage, lavender plants, tended carefully for both medicine and flavor. A monk kneels to adjust a small wooden marker and greets you with a smile that says he knows exactly how soothing this place feels. As the group disperses, you notice a young novice struggling to carry a stack of firewood. It teeters precariously, wobbling like it's auditioning for a disaster. You rush forward, steadying it before it collapses, and he exhales in relief. "Blessings," he says breathlessly. "Wood has a mind of its own." You nod. Everything in medieval Europe seems to have a mind of its own. Weather, animals, tools, neighbors' pigs, even apples if you ask the wrong noble. In the refectory, long wooden tables stretch across the room, and the scent of warm broth curls around your senses. Monks eat in silence while one reads from a lectern, usually scripture, occasionally a stern moral story about why you shouldn't steal your brother's sandals. You take a seat at the end, and the meal is simple but comforting. Bread, beans, and a small piece of cheese that tastes slightly better than the mud you inhaled yesterday. As you eat, you absorb the rhythm of monastic time. Here, every hour is marked by bells, work, prayer, study, meals, rest, repeat. It's predictable, in a way the outside world can never be. You imagine what it would feel like to live this life. Safe from the raids, the taxes, the fields, the wolves allegedly the size of horses. Instead, you would face strict schedules, long days, and the constant threat of becoming the caretaker of chickens that refuse to behave. Outside again, you stand beneath the abbey's modest tower. A soft breeze sweeps through the courtyard, carrying with it the faint smell of vellum and herbs. A monk beside you clasps his hands behind his back and murmurs, "The world changes out there, but here we keep time." And you realize he's right. The abbey is a quiet island in the medieval tide, a sanctuary where the past, present, and future are all carefully copied, shelved, and guarded by men who believe that words are worth preserving, even when everything else is uncertain. You step through the gate, leaving the silence behind you, feeling just a bit steadier as you walk back toward the wider world of medieval Europe. You leave the abbey with its cool stone corridors and disciplined stillness, and as soon as your feet touch the dirt path beyond its gate, the world feels louder again, birds calling from tree branches, carts creaking in the distance, and somewhere a dog barking like it just learned how and wants everyone to know. You walk downhill toward a narrow road that stretches across the countryside like a long, tired ribbon. This is where the quiet of monastic life gives way to something else entirely. Movement, trade, travel, and the muddy arteries that connect medieval Europe together. The road itself is not glamorous. Forget smooth cobblestones and charming bridges, those exist mostly in cities and high-budget movies. Out here, the road is a churned-up track of dirt and ruts, half swallowed by grass in places, deeply gouged in others where wagon wheels sank after last week's rain. When you step into one rut, your foot disappears up to the ankle, and you immediately understand why medieval people had permanent calf muscles that defied logic. You spot a group approaching from the bend-ahead merchants, with a pair of donkeys laden with sacks and bundles tied so tightly they resemble lumpy, overstuffed pillows. As they get closer, you hear them discussing the price of salt, which seems to rise and fall as unpredictably as modern gas prices. The leader of the group, a man with a thick beard and a sturdy walking stick, gives you a nod. "Road's clear today," he says, which sounds reassuring until he adds, "No bandits since last week." You smile the smile of someone pretending to be comforted. A mainstream historical fact flits into your mind. Around this era, trade in Europe is slowly reawakening after centuries of instability. Markets are expanding, towns are reappearing, and long-distance trade routes are knitting together regions that once felt impossibly isolated. But the roads themselves? Still terrible, still muddy, still full of the medieval equivalent of customer service obstacles. As you fall into step beside the merchants, one of them rummages through a sack and pulls out a handful of dried figs. He offers you one, and you accept because in a world where meals are unpredictable, you do not say no to snacks. The fig is chewy, sweet, and surprisingly comforting. He grins. "From the coast," he explains. "Traded 2 bolts of wool for them. Worth it." You agree. You'd trade 2 bolts of wool for anything that tastes better than onion soup and boiled beans. Further up the road, you pass a wagon stuck in mud. 2 men strain at the wheels, while a woman pokes the mud with a long stick, as if hoping it will suddenly decide to let go out of sheer politeness. A horse stands nearby, judging everyone. You join in the effort, pushing the rear wheel with your shoulder until the wagon lurches forward with a sloppy, triumphant squelch. The woman wipes her forehead and thanks you before continuing her journey toward a nearby market town. As you resume walking, you overhear a conversation about tolls. Apparently, a bridge up ahead has a fee for crossing, and the price changes depending on who's collecting it that day. Historians still argue whether medieval tolls were standardized or whether collectors simply woke up, stretched, and decided, today feels like a 3-penny day. You continue down the winding road until you reach a makeshift wayside stand. A simple canopy of cloth supported by sticks, under which an old man is selling needles, thread, and small metal trinkets shaped like animals. He waves at travelers with the enthusiasm of someone who knows foot traffic is his lifeblood. You sift through the trinkets and find a tiny bronze pig that looks like it's trying very hard to be majestic. "That one brings good harvests," the vendor claims. You raise an eyebrow, and he shrugs. "Well, it brings something." A quirky tidbit emerges as you browse. The old man explains that many travelers tie small charms to their belts to stay safe from road spirits. He gestures toward a little line of symbols hanging from his own belt circles, spirals, a miniature axe. You nod appreciatively, making a mental note that medieval people had anxiety accessories long before fidget spinners existed. Continuing on, you pass a troop of men-at-arms escorting a noble's supply cart. They march with grim focus, spears upright, faces stern, boots moving in perfect rhythm. You step aside, and they don't break formation, not even to acknowledge you. The captain at the front glances your way briefly, giving you the expression of a man who has spent years telling people, "Please stay out of the way," without needing to speak. You notice something subtle. The presence of soldiers makes the road feel safer, but also tenser. Travelers give them wide berth. Merchants lower their voices. Even the donkeys seem to reconsider their life choices. The road eventually dips toward a shallow river. There's no bridge here, just a stony ford where the water bubbles over smooth rocks. A group ahead is debating whether the horses can cross without slipping. One insists yes, another insists absolutely not, and both seem equally confident. You, attempting neutrality, just roll up your trousers and step carefully into the cool water, letting it swirl around your legs. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely preferred river crossings like these, or simply had no other choice until bridge building improved. But from your soaked hemline, you suspect it's the latter. On the opposite bank, another merchant sits on a boulder, repairing a broken wheel with a mallet and a remarkable amount of patience. You watch him for a moment, each tap steady, measured, almost meditative. When he catches your eye, he shrugs. "Road doesn't fix itself," he says. "Someone's always mending something." And that becomes the quiet truth of medieval travel. Slow, unpredictable, sometimes dangerous, occasionally humorous, and always held together by people who refuse to let the road fall completely apart. As the afternoon sun softens, you continue along the path, surrounded by the gentle sounds of creaking wagons, jingling harnesses, murmured conversations, and the never-ending squish of muddy footprints. Every traveler you meet adds another thread to the tapestry of movement, a reminder that even in a world without engines, Europe is already stirring, connecting, expanding, one weary step at a time. You continue along the winding road until it thins into a narrow path, one that feels less like a route of trade and more like a trail of intention. The travelers here look different, not merchants or farmers, not soldiers or stewards, but men and women carrying staffs, rosaries, small bundles of food, and that unmistakable expression shared by people who've committed to something difficult and are now questioning their decisions. These are pilgrims, and you quietly fall into step beside them. The air shifts as you join the group. It feels lighter somehow, tinged with purpose, though still firmly grounded in the reality of sore feet and unreliable weather. One of the pilgrims, an older woman with a walking stick polished smooth from years of use, nods at you. "Heading to the shrine?" she asks. You hesitate. You hadn't planned on a long religious trek, but before you can answer, she smiles in that knowing, medieval mom way. "You'll figure it out on the way." And just like that, you're a pilgrim too. The path winds through rolling fields and into a stretch of deep forest. Sunlight filters down through leaves in thin golden spears, the forest floor blanketed with moss and ferns. The pilgrims walk single file, some humming hymns under their breath, others muttering complaints about blisters. You're relieved to discover that complaining is apparently a universal and timeless element of spiritual journeys. A mainstream historical fact settles into your thoughts. Pilgrimage was one of the defining experiences of medieval Europe. Thousands set out every year seeking healing, forgiveness, adventure, miracles, or simply an excuse to leave home for a while. The destinations varied. Local shrines, famous cathedrals, distant holy sites. But the experience? Always long, always uncertain, always transformative, unless you gave up halfway and went home, which also happened more often than religious writers like to admit. You step over a fallen log, the bark flaking beneath your boots, and glance at the man walking beside you. He's younger than you expected, wearing a rough cloak patched so many times it looks like a quilt. Hanging from his neck is a scallop shell, the universal badge of a pilgrim heading toward Compostela. He notices your glance and taps the shell. "Gift from a monk," he explains. "Said it would protect me from thieves, or lightning, or stomach aches." He wasn't very clear. A quirky tidbit emerges as you continue. One woman in the group brings out a small leather pouch containing dried herbs, She crushes a few between her fingers and sprinkles them on the path, claiming it keeps mischievous forest spirits from tangling your feet. Historians still argue whether such rituals were genuine traditions or improvised travel hacks based on whatever herbs people happen to have lying around. The forest eventually breaks open into a wide meadow dotted with wildflowers. The pilgrims pause to rest, lowering themselves onto soft grass. Someone passes around a jug of watered wine. Someone else pulls out a loaf of coarse bread. Medieval picnics are not glamorous, but after walking for hours, everything tastes better, even the bread that crumbles like it's made of compressed sand. As you eat, a bearded pilgrim with a voice like gravel tells a story about a shrine he visited years ago. According to him, a goat wandered into the chapel, slipped on the stone floor, and fell dramatically at the foot of a statue, immediately leading several witnesses to proclaim it a miracle. Historians still argue whether the goat was truly guided, he says with a smirk, or just having a particularly clumsy day. Everyone laughs, except one man who looks genuinely troubled by the theological implications of goats. After the break, the group rises and continues forward. The path grows steeper, the incline raising your heartbeat. Your legs begin that slow burn of mild regret, and you envy the older, the woman who climbs steadily as if her joints are made of stubborn determination rather than plausible biology. As you walk, the conversation shifts toward relics, the objects of devotion that draw pilgrims across continents. One person mentions a church claiming to have a feather from the Archangel Michael. Another insists he saw a vial of holy water that never evaporates, no matter how hot the summer gets. You wonder how many relics are real. Historians still argue about that too. But in a world where uncertainty is constant, even questionable relics bring comfort. Late in the afternoon, the group arrives at a small roadside shrine, just a stone cross set on a pedestal, with beeswax candles melted down its sides like golden tears. A few pilgrims kneel, murmuring prayers. Others simply place a pebble at its base, a humble but meaningful offering. You kneel for a moment too, feeling the cool earth beneath you and the faint scent of melted wax drifting in the breeze. One of the pilgrims, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek, touches the cross lightly and whispers, "For my brother." Then he rises and gives you a nod. Not everything in medieval life is said aloud. As evening approaches, the group reaches a small inn, a simple building with a thatched roof and smoke curling from its chimney. The innkeeper greets the pilgrims warmly, not out of pure generosity, but because hosting them is a dependable business model in a world where foot traffic is guaranteed. Inside, the floor is straw-covered, the benches are uneven, and the stew bubbling in the pot smells vaguely of onions, barley, and hope. You squeeze into a bench beside the others. Laughter rolls through the room, mixing with the crackle of the hearth. A traveling musician plucks a melody on a rebec slightly off-key, but charming. You feel the weight of the day settling into your muscles, but not unpleasantly. It's the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from moving with purpose, even if you still don't fully understand what that purpose is for you. Later, as you lie on your straw mattress, listening to snores that range from gentle whistles to full-on bear roars, you realize something about medieval pilgrimage. It's not really about the destination. It's the slow, steady steps, the company of strangers, the shared stories, the rituals and doubts and small wonders found along the road. You pull your blanket tighter, close your eyes, and drift into sleep, just another pilgrim on a long, uncertain path through medieval Europe. Morning light filters through the cracks in the shutters of the inn, landing in dusty beams across the floor. You push yourself upright from your straw mattress, brushing a stray piece of hay from your cheek, though at this point, medieval, you simply accepts that you will always be wearing at least 3 pieces of straw at all times. The rest of the pilgrims stir slowly, groaning in that universal, "Why did I walk so far? Yesterday?" language. But today your path leads away from them. While they continue toward their shrine, you drift toward a different kind of medieval figure, one whose silhouette looms large in stories, songs, and questionable modern reenactments, the knight. You part ways near a crossroads, waving goodbye to the pilgrims as they shrink into the distance. Ahead of you rises a stretch of open land broken by low hills, where a cluster of tents and wooden targets forms a training ground. The thud of hooves, the clang of metal, and the short, sharp shouts of instructors drift across the field. As you approach, a rider on horseback gallops past, armor gleaming or trying to gleam under the sun. The horse kicks up dirt, and the knight leans into the movement with practiced ease. You can't help but be impressed. Right until he tries to stop too quickly, wobbles in the saddle, and nearly performs a very unheroic somersault into a bush. He recovers, raises a gauntlet in embarrassed triumph, and trots away as if nothing happened. Perfect chivalric dignity. A mainstream historical fact slips into your thoughts as you observe the chaos. By the 11th and 12th centuries, knights were emerging as a distinct warrior class. Heavy cavalry became central to military power, and knights mounted, armored, and trained from youth were expected to uphold ideals of bravery, loyalty, and honorable conduct. These ideals sounded beautiful on parchment, and were frequently ignored in practice. Historians still argue whether chivalry was genuinely a moral code, or mostly propaganda invented to make very violent men seem more wholesome. You wander toward the practice yard, where a group of squires, teenagers, with the combined energy of nervous puppies and overconfident goats, are struggling to lift chainmail shirts over their heads. One squire gets his arm tangled and spins in a slow, defeated circle until another helps him. You try not to laugh, but he sees you and grins. Anyway. First time? He asks. You shake your head. Just watching. He nods sagely. Best choice. Nearby, a knight in partial armor sits on a bench, rubbing salve onto a bruise the size of a small apple. When he catches you staring, he shrugs. Training accident, he mutters. Or as Sir Geoffrey calls it, a learning opportunity. He leans closer. Everything is a learning opportunity when he's not the one getting hit. You sense a pattern. Medieval knights are fearsome on horseback, but deeply relatable on the ground. You step over to a rack of armor pieces, running your hand along cold steel plates and the woven links of chainmail. A passing knight laughs when he sees you lift one of the gauntlets and nearly drop it. Armor's not elegant, he says. It's heavy, hot, loud. Takes half an hour to put on and twice as long to take off. Romance fades quickly. He's right. You watch as another knight tries to adjust his greaves, only to pinch a sliver of skin in the process. His howl echoes across the field, and two squires rush to help while trying very hard not to laugh. Chivalry does not protect you from poorly placed buckles. A quirky tidbit emerges during your wanderings. One knight proudly tells you that he wears a tiny charm sewn into the lining of his surcoat. A sliver of bone from what he claims is the rib of a saint's donkey. Protects me in battle, he says confidently. Historians still argue whether knights truly relied on such talismans, or if some were just creative with their superstition budget. A troop of riders assembles for a jousting drill. You move to a safe distance after all. Getting run over by a horse is not on your medieval bucket list. The knights lower their lances, aim for the rotating wooden dummy, known as the quintain, and charge. The first rider's lance connects with a sharp crack, sending the dummy spinning wildly. The squire manning it dives out of the way, arms flailing, as the 12 counterweight swings past his ear. The second rider misses entirely and nearly unseats himself. The third hits perfectly, but lets out a cheer too soon and drops his lance in celebration. You suspect that medieval tournaments were equal parts skill and slapstick. At the edge of the field, you meet an older man repairing a saddle. His hands work with quiet precision, and his eyes carry decades of watching young warriors come and go. Everyone wants to be a knight, he says softly. They think it's glory, songs, fine armor, but most days, it's mud, sweat, training until your arms feel like soup. He ties a knot tightly. Glory comes rarely, blisters come daily. You sit with that for a moment, watching another group of knights struggling to mount their horses in full armor. One man needs two squires to push him upward, while a third pulls the reins. When he finally lands in the saddle, the horse gives a long, theatrical sigh. As the day continues, you sense the duality of knighthood all around you. On one hand, honor, prestige, battlefield supremacy. On the other, constant exhaustion, impossible weight, and the daily risk of injury before you've even left the training yard. Historians still argue whether knights were admired community protectors or intimidating enforcers of their lord's will. But watching them now laughing, limping, adjusting their gear, snapping at squires, boasting about bruises, you see something more human than legend. Evening approaches, painting the sky in soft orange and rose. The knights gather for supper inside a long wooden hall, and you join them, sliding onto a bench near the back. Bowls of stew appear, bread passes from hand to hand. Stories erupt, some heroic, many wildly exaggerated. You laugh quietly as one knight claims he once scared away 6 bandits just by glaring at them. Another rolls his eyes. "They were goats," he says. "You scared goats." The hall roars with laughter. Later, as the fire crackles and the conversation softens, you feel the warmth of the room settle around you. The armor leaning against the walls glints softly in the firelight. The horses outside snort sleepily in their stalls. The world of knights, for all its myths, feels strangely grounded, more sweat than spectacle, more practice than perfection. You step outside, letting the night air cool your face. In the distance, the dark silhouettes of the hills stretch across the horizon, and somewhere, a lone rider practices late into the night, lance glinting under the moon. You walk away slowly, leaving the clatter of armor behind as your path winds deeper into the 1,000-year story of medieval Europe. You leave the training field just as the last echoes of laughter fade, stepping back onto the long dirt road that winds across the countryside. The sun hangs low, the sky deepening into that soft gradient between peach and blue, and the first cool breath of evening brushes against your cheeks. For a moment, everything feels calm. But medieval Europe never stays calm for long. As you crest a gentle hill, you spot a cluster of tents in the distance, not the relaxed, sing-song tents of merchants or pilgrims, but sharper, heavier silhouettes arranged with military precision. Banners flap in the wind, each painted with a cross, a lion, a pair of keys, or other bold symbols. Men gather around crackling fires, some sharpening swords, others repairing armor, others murmuring fervent prayers. You've walked straight into a crusader mustering camp. The smell of wood smoke, horses, sweat, and boiled barley fills the air. You step closer, and the atmosphere shifts immediately, tense, earnest, buzzing with a mixture of zeal, fear, ambition, and the kind of peer pressure that happens when your neighbor decides he's going to save the Holy Land, and suddenly you feel weird staying home. A mainstream historical fact surfaces in your mind. By the late 11th century, the First Crusade had been called, and across Europe, people answered. Knights, peasants, nobles, monks, wanderers, everyone from seasoned warriors to men who had never held a sword but were convinced God would teach them on the way. The idea of marching east toward Jerusalem spread like wildfire, fueled by faith, politics, opportunity, and, in some cases, deeply poor planning. Historians still argue whether the Crusades were mostly religious movements, political expansions, economic ventures, or a chaotic mixture of all three. Walking into this camp, you feel the mixture instantly. You pass a group of knights kneeling before a makeshift altar, whispering prayers. Their armor is spotless, their cloaks immaculate, and their expressions a mix of determination and dread. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head, looks up at you. "Off to Jerusalem as well?" he asks. You hesitate because you'd really only intended to cross the field to find dinner, but before you can answer, another knight claps you on the back hard enough to jolt your spine. "Then may God guide your steps," he booms. You nod awkwardly. You've been conscripted into enthusiasm. Nearby, a squire struggles to buckle a cuirass onto his knight, tugging at the straps like he's trying to wrestle a stubborn animal. Another squire rushes past you carrying a giant kettle of stew, its contents sloshing dangerously. You sidestep, just in time to avoid a medieval Burns situation. At the edge of the camp, a preacher stands atop a barrel, voice ringing out dramatically. He gestures wildly with each sentence, cloak billowing behind him like he's auditioning for a celestial stage play. The crowd around him listens with rapt attention, though one man appears to be there mostly for shade. "For the path is long," the preacher cries, "but the reward is eternal." "Does the reward include dinner?" someone mutters near you. You try not to laugh. You move to the quieter corner of the camp, passing a group of low-born recruits. Some carry spears taller than themselves. Some have padded jackets instead of proper armor. One man clutches a frying pan with grim determination, as if he fully intends to bludgeon the forces of darkness using cookware alone. You respect the confidence. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you listen. One recruit proudly shows off a small pouch containing what he claims are holy stones, pebbles blessed by a traveling monk. He insists that if he throws them at enemies, they'll fly straighter than normal rocks. His friend rolls his eyes so hard it's a miracle they don't spin out of his skull. The camp bustles with nervous preparation, blacksmiths hammering last-minute repairs, cooks stirring vats of thick porridge, men pacing with restless energy, women sewing torn cloaks or mending gloves. Horses whinny, stamping their hooves in impatience or hunger or existential dread. You're not sure which. You wander toward the command tent. Its canvas thicker than the others, and secured with heavy ropes. 2 guards stand at the entrance, one looking alert, the other doing that medieval thing where you pretend you're awake and very serious, even though your eyes keep drifting shut every 4 seconds. He snaps to attention when you pass, and then promptly pretends nothing happened. Inside, a few men pore over maps spread across a large table. You sneak close enough to see the rough outlines of Europe, the Mediterranean, and the distant territories marked with crosses and scribbles. One commander traces the route with his finger. "We'll cross the Alps here," he says. The other winces. "My cousin crossed the Alps once, froze his beard clean off. That is not helpful," the commander replies. Historians still argue whether Crusader plans were brilliantly strategic or wildly optimistic. Judging from these men, it's definitely leaning toward optimistic. As the last rays of sunlight dip, behind the hills, torches flare to life, lighting the camp with a flickering orange glow. You take a seat on a log as a pot of dinner stew is passed around. It's thick, hearty, and tastes faintly of garlic and ambition. A knight nearby lifts his bowl toward you. "Tomorrow," he says, "we march for something greater than ourselves." He takes a bite, winces, and mutters, "Though this stew is certainly not part of the reward." The men around him chuckle. A young man, barely more than a boy, sits beside you. His hands shake as he tries to tie a strap on his shield. You help him, and he gives you a grateful, nervous smile. "Do you think we'll see miracles?" he asks quietly. You think for a moment, listening to the crackle of torches, the murmured prayers, the clank of armor echoing through the dark. "Maybe," you say softly, "but you'll definitely see blisters." He laughs, a small, fragile sound, but it steadies him. Night deepens. The camp gradually settles. Some men sleep, others pace. A few kneel in prayer beneath the star-filled sky. The air is cool and sharp with anticipation, and you stand among them, surrounded by faith, fear, camaraderie, confusion, and the restless energy of a continent stirring toward war. The crusading age is dawning, and you feel the shift in the wind as medieval Europe begins to stretch far beyond its borders. Dawn breaks with a pale haze, the sky smudged with watercolor blues and faint orange streaks. The Crusader camp behind you is already waking, men stretching stiff limbs, horses snorting clouds of mist, cooks stirring pots with the unspoken rule that breakfast must taste slightly worse than dinner. You slip away from the bustle, following a narrow track that winds eastward, before bending toward a valley where smoke rises in soft, lazy threads. As you crest a hill, you see it, a town. Not a village, not a manor, not a fortified camp, but a town, alive with movement even at this early hour. It's surrounded by half-built stone walls, patched in places with timber. A wooden gate stands open, and people drift in and out like bees moving to and from a hive. Compared to the scattered hamlets you've wandered through, this place feels like someone poured all the surrounding countryside into a single, crowded bowl. You walk toward it, boots crunching on gravel. The moment you pass under the gate, sound hits you like a wave, voices shouting, chickens complaining, wheels rattling, blacksmiths hammering, children laughing, dogs barking at absolutely nothing. For the first time in days, you feel like you're in a place that doesn't just exist, it grows, stretches, breathes. A mainstream historical fact floats into your mind. By the 12th and 13th centuries, towns across Europe began to swell rapidly. Trade increased, craftsmanship expanded, markets multiplied, urban life returned in force, transforming the economic landscape. And from the look of it, you've stepped into one of those newly rising centers, messy, noisy, vibrant, and slightly overwhelmed by its own momentum. You move deeper into the bustle. Stalls line the main street, each piled with goods that smell and look interesting, in that medieval, just trust me way. One merchant sells spices, ginger, pepper, cinnamon, all eye-wateringly expensive. Another offers dyed wool in bright reds and blues that look so saturated you wonder what ingredients went into them. Probably something that stains permanently. Maybe fingers. A quirky tidbit hits you when a teenager approaches holding a tray of pastries, yes. Pastries that look surprisingly modern. When you ask what they are, he tells you proudly they're honey cakes baked with the secret ingredient of my master's shop. You wait for something mystical, but he adds, Goat's milk warmed exactly the amount of time it takes to recite 3 short prayers. Any longer, and the cakes turn mean. You buy one anyway. It's delicious, not mean at all. You wander further, dodging a man carrying a crate of fish and a woman balancing pottery on her head. Every few steps, someone shouts about their goods. Finest cloth in the region, salted pork, guaranteed not to bite back. Rosewater for your beloved if you have one. You stop at a busy stall where a blacksmith demonstrates an iron lock to a crowd. He turns, the key dramatically, the mechanism clicking smooth and firm. People gasp as if witnessing magic. And in a way, locks aren't common yet. The idea that you can protect belongings with cold, shaped metal feels impressively modern, in a world where most security still relies on hope and a dog. Historians still argue whether medieval towns developed organically or through deliberate planning. Looking around this chaos, you'd bet heavily on organic, with a side influence of everyone built whatever felt right and now regrets it. The streets twist unpredictably narrow here, wide there, looping around buildings that look like they grew sideways. You turn a corner and nearly collide with a group of guild apprentices carrying barrels. They mutter apologies, cheeks flushed with the stress of not dropping anything in front of their master, a stern man who watches them like a hawk with outstanding unpaid taxes. You slip into a quieter alley, full of workshops, carpenters' plain wood, tanners stretch hides that smell like a monster's armpit. Candle makers dip long strings of wicks into vats of hot tallow, creating rows of pale, waxy stalactites. A woman shaping clay jars hums softly as she works, hands moving with practiced grace. Her workshop is warm, earthy, alive with the scent of wet clay. But the busiest place of all is the market square. When you step into it, the energy hits you like a jolt. Dozens of stalls circle a central fountain. Peddlers wave ribbons, fabrics, knives, charms, gourds, clumsy wooden toys, and pastries shaped like spirals. People haggle loudly, using hand gestures so dramatic they could be mistaken for small-scale battle reenactments. You get caught between 2 merchants arguing about grain prices. It was 5 silver last month, and the weather was better last month. That has nothing to do with it. Everything has to do with everything. You back away slowly. On one side of the square, a group of jugglers performs for children. Their balls arc beautifully through the air until one misjudges, and a ball bounces off a cart horse's side. The horse snorts indignantly and nearly joins the act by kicking a barrel. You spot a man selling manuscripts, tiny books, song verses, scraps of copied psalms, not fancy illuminated volumes from monasteries, but practical pocket texts that townsfolk can actually buy. It hits you. Literacy is growing. Slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. The energy of this rising town isn't just physical, it's intellectual. You continue exploring until you stumble upon something unexpected. A public notice board. Posted parchments flutter in the breeze, announcements from the Lord, prices set by the guilds, warnings about pickpockets, and one paper advertising a miraculous rat-catching cat available to hire. You admire the entrepreneurial spirit. But towns also bring risks. In a shadowed corner, a man warns travelers about recent thefts near the North Gate. A woman tells you quietly that last week someone tried to sell fake relics again. A child runs past you shouting happily, chased by another child wielding a stick shaped like a sword. Towns are chaotic, complicated, loud, alive. Historians still argue whether medieval towns offered more freedom or simply replaced rural obligations with urban ones. Watching the guildmasters bark orders, you suspect the answer is both, and neither, and it depends on who you ask. As twilight settles, torches ignite, casting warm flickers across stone and timber. Tavern doors swing open, spilling laughter and music into the streets. You step into one just to rest your legs and find a long wooden table crowded with townsfolk enjoying ale and stew. Someone calls you over. You sit, you eat, you listen. Stories fill the air of trade caravans, sea voyages, lost sheep, unexpected romances, and one man who swears he saw a dragon the size of a very large cow. You smile. As night deepens, you step outside again. The town glows warmly. People bustle, doors close, lanterns sway in the wind, and the realization settles over you. This place noisy, unpredictable, full of ambition and anxiety, is Europe changing in real time, and you're walking right through its beating heart. You wake the next morning to the sounds of the town already bustling, vendors shouting, carts rolling, someone loudly insisting that the fish he's selling is fresh enough to still dream of the river. You stretch your arms, feeling the faint ache of yesterday's wandering, and step outside into an alley washed in early sunlight. Today, your path weaves deeper into the arteries of urban life, not through markets this time, but into the organized, rule-bound heart of every medieval town, the guilds. You follow the flow of townsfolk toward a wide street lined with workshops. The air is a lively mix of scents: fresh-cut wood, boiling dye, hot iron, cured leather, bread baking somewhere nearby, and, less pleasantly, whatever is happening at the tanner's workshop. You try not to inhale too deeply. A mainstream historical fact sparks in your thoughts. From the 12th century onward, guilds became the backbone of Europe's growing towns. They regulated trades, trained apprentices, set standards, guarded secrets, and shaped entire professions. Each craft, smiths, bakers, masons, weavers, cobblers, had its own guild, its own rules, and its own pride. You step into the street just as a guildmaster emerges from a stone building wearing a deep blue robe embroidered with tiny golden shears, his symbol. He carries a ledger under his arm and an expression that suggests he hasn't smiled since the last good harvest. He gives you a curt nod. Buying or learning? Just observing, you answer. He narrows his eyes. Observing is allowed. Interfering is not. And with that cheerful welcome, he marches away. You drift toward the open workshops. In the first, a carpenter shaves a plank with steady strokes, curls of pale wood falling like ribbons. A young apprentice stands beside him, nervous energy radiating from every part of his body. Hold the board firm, the carpenter instructs. I am holding it firm, the boy replies. You're holding it like you're afraid it'll break. I am afraid it'll break. That's because you're holding it wrong. You step aside as the boy sighs heavily, muttering something that's definitely the medieval equivalent of, I need a new job. Moving on, you enter a street where weavers work at large wooden looms. Their feet pump pedals, while their hands guide threads through intricate patterns. A woman pauses to greet you, her fingers still deftly tying a knot. Guild rules say, I can't tell you how we make this pattern, she says, smiling, but I can tell you that if you try it without training, your loom will collapse and possibly hit you on the head. You laugh politely, mostly because she seems genuinely concerned. You continue wandering, passing dyers with stained hands, rope makers twisting thick cords between pegs, and bakers sliding loaves into ovens. One baker hands you a small roll, still warm. Taste it, he insists. You do. It's soft, rich, unexpectedly wonderful. That one's from the guild-approved recipe, he says proudly. Guild disapproves of anything less. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you listen to a pair of leatherworkers near a stall. One mentions that their guild recently fined a member for making a pair of boots so ugly that even the pigs refused to wear them. The other swears the boots cursed the workshop until they were burned. Historians still argue whether medieval guild fines were always about craftsmanship or sometimes about petty revenge. Judging from these stories, you suspect both. You step into the workshop of the Metalworkers Guild next. Sparks fly as hammers strike glowing iron. The heat washes over you with each clang, warming your face. One smith in a soot-streaked apron sets down his hammer and wipes sweat from his brow. Want to try? He asks, gesturing toward a small anvil. You take the hammer and immediately understand why medieval blacksmiths all look like they could arm wrestle a dragon. The hammer is heavy, awkward, and clearly designed for someone with far stronger wrists than yours. You lift it anyway and attempt a basic tap on a bit of iron. Your tap makes a sad little clink. The smith nods sympathetically. Good first effort. It was absolutely not a good first effort. Outside, an argument suddenly erupts between two coopers rolling barrels. One accuses the other of shaving the staves too thin. The other retorts that his accuser couldn't seal a barrel even if God himself held the hoops. They bicker loudly until a guild official steps in, citing regulations neither of them seems able to remember correctly. You back away slowly. Guilds are organized, but also chaotic. Structured, but also deeply dramatic. As you reach a quieter lane, you notice a building larger than the others, a guild hall. Its heavy wooden door is carved with symbols of tools: chisels, hammers, needles, saws. You slip inside. The hall is dim but impressive, with long benches, tall windows, and a large painted emblem on the wall depicting hands clasping over a tool. Here, masters gather to make decisions, prices, training rules, hiring standards, dispute resolutions. It's the medieval version of a regulatory board, but with more shouting and significantly fewer spreadsheets. A meeting is underway. You linger at the back, listening. One master argues passionately that apprentices should serve 7 years. Another insists 6 should be enough. A third says apprentices these days are too lazy anyway and should actually serve 8. Voices rise. Hands wave. Someone bangs a mug on the table in frustration. Historians still argue whether guilds protected quality or stifled innovation. Watching these men debate the length of apprenticeships like the fate of the universe hangs in the balance, you suspect the answer once again is, it depends whom you ask. After the meeting ends, you step back into the street, where life continues in overlapping waves of productivity. You notice that everyone masters, journeymen, apprentices, moves with purpose. Guild life is demanding but consistent. The rules are strict, but the community is strong. As the sun begins to lower, the workshops close one by one. Apprentices sweep floors. Masters lock doors. Someone tosses wash water into the street, narrowly missing your boots. You sigh. You should have expected that. You drift toward the town's central square again, where candles and lanterns flicker to life. Workers settle at tavern tables, sharing ale and stories of the day. One mason complains about a stone that refused to fit no matter how he chiseled it. Another laments that his apprentice accidentally dyed all the wool purple instead of blue. Through their laughter, grumbling, and camaraderie, you feel the heartbeat of the town, not loud like the market, not tense like the Crusader camp, not serene like the abbey. Instead, it's the steady, rhythmic pulse of craft and community. You watch a group of guild members raise their mugs together, their hands rough with labor, their clothes stained with ink or dye or soot, their faces lit softly by the glow of lanterns. Medieval Europe isn't just kings, knights, monks, or peasants. It's workers, tens of thousands of them, shaping cities one craft at a time. And as you wander back into the evening light, you realize you've just walked through the engine room of a civilization, slowly rediscovering its strength. You leave the guild quarter behind, as lanterns begin to glow in evening windows, and workers drift toward taverns, stretching sore backs and comparing the day's injuries like medals. The street narrows again, winding uphill toward a higher part of town, where the houses grow sturdier, the guards stand a little straighter, and the air carries a faint, unmistakable scent of authority like old parchment mixed with cautious optimism. This is where the crowns of medieval Europe begin to reveal themselves. Your first glimpse comes in the form of a mounted messenger, wearing the colors of a nearby kingdom. He gallops past you, cloak snapping behind him, horse hooves clattering on the stones with the urgency of someone carrying news important enough to skip dinner. A few seconds later, 2 children argue about which king the messenger serves, each insisting their version is correct, each absolutely certain despite being about 7 years old. A mainstream historical fact drifts into your mind. By the 12th and 13th centuries, European monarchs were struggling, sometimes creatively, sometimes desperately, to centralize their power. Feudal lords ruled their lands like miniature kings. Bishops controlled wealth and influence, and cities were growing bold. To be a medieval king meant constantly negotiating, threatening, granting favors, revoking favors, minting coins, unminting coins, issuing decrees, cancelling decrees, and occasionally fighting wars just to remind everyone you existed. You walk toward the town hall, where banners in rich colors hang from the upper windows. Inside, you find a small but bustling administrative chamber, scribes scratching away at parchment, clerks sorting wooden tally sticks, and an exhausted reeve muttering, "No, no, no. That field is taxed next season. Not this season." To a man who clearly doesn't care, you slip out quickly before someone hands you paperwork. Further uphill looms the residence of the local lord, larger than the surrounding homes but smaller than the castles you've seen. Guards stand at attention, sweating politely in their helmets. One squints at you with suspicion. "Business with the lord?" he asks. "No," you say. "Good," he replies, visibly relaxing. He's in a mood. You hear a shout from inside. You decide the guard was right. But you're not here to disturb temperamental nobles. You're here to witness the shifting balance of medieval power. You wander past a chapel where townsfolk gather around a travelling royal official. He stands on a wooden box, reading from a scroll stamped with a golden seal. His voice carries down the street. By order of His Grace, new coinage will circulate this season. Old coins must be exchanged at the prescribed rate. The crowd murmurs. Some cheer, some groan. One man whispers loudly, "Last time I exchanged coins, I lost enough money to feed 3 goats." His friend sighs. "You don't have goats." He sighs deeper. "That's why." This royal decree may seem small, but it's part of something larger. Kings tightening control over currency, taxation, military service, and justice. Each change is a chess move. In a long, complicated game, historians still argue whether medieval kings were powerful rulers or simply figureheads perched on unstable thrones. The truth sits somewhere in the messy middle. Kings wielded authority, but only as far as their lords, bishops, cities, armies, and luck allowed. You continue along the street as a tiny parade approaches, not large, not majestic, just serious enough to make people step aside. At the center rides a royal envoy, dressed in a fine cloak embroidered with a lion. His horse carries saddlebags stuffed with letters, charters, and probably at least one snack. He dismounts near the church and is greeted by the mayor, who bows so deeply he nearly face-plants into the dust. The envoy clears his throat dramatically and says, "I bring word from the crown." The mayor nods solemnly. Then the envoy adds, "Also, I'm terribly hungry. Do you have bread?" The mayor snaps his fingers, and a servant runs off. Medieval diplomacy runs on carbs. You drift toward the courtyard behind the church, where a group of townsfolk debate today's announcement. "It means more taxes," one says gloomily. "It means more protection," says another. "It means less freedom," argues a third. "It means the king's trying," says a fourth. "It means nothing until they fix the road outside the west gate," mutters someone at the back. You get the sense that no matter the century, no matter the continent, local politics always devolves into road maintenance complaints. A quirky tidbit enters your orbit as a man boasts that his cousin once met the king and received a loaf of sweetbread in exchange for exceptional loyalty. You don't know what exceptional loyalty looks like, but you imagine the sweetbread was the highlight. As you climb further uphill, you reach a lookout point just as the sun begins to set, staining the sky with gold. From here, you can see not just the town, but the fields, forests, and rivers beyond patches of authority stretching outward. This is what kings want. Not just land and castles, not just taxes and armies, but reach, influence, presence. You imagine royal messengers galloping from one end of the kingdom to the other. Judges sent to impose law, tax collectors dispatched with chests and quills, soldiers called for campaigns, knights pledging oaths, merchants paying tolls, guilds receiving charters. Power radiates outward from the crown, but not smoothly, not consistently, not uncontested. Historians still argue whether medieval monarchies laid the foundation of modern states or simply stumbled into systems that happened to evolve later. But standing here, watching the lights flicker across the town, you sense something undeniably shifting slowly, unevenly, but persistently. Night deepens. A cool breeze brushes your face. Bells ring across the rooftops. The guards at the Lord's residence light torches, their flames dancing in the wind. Somewhere below, a drunk man loudly insists he is a king too, just a king of beer, before tripping over a barrel. You smile and begin your descent. The path leads you away from the chatter of officials and toward the quieter edge of the town, where the influence of crowns meets the lives of ordinary people, and where the next chapter of medieval Europe is waiting for you in the dimming light. You descend from the hilltop as the lamps flicker to life across the town, their warm glow spilling into doorways and stretching across cobblestones like liquid gold. The murmur of voices, the clatter of shutters closing, the fading clang of a distant smith's hammer, all of it blends into a soft evening hum. But beneath the noise, beneath the commerce and guild rivalries and royal decrees, something else pulses through medieval Europe: the church. Not just the chapels you've wandered past, not just the abbey you explored earlier, but the vast, immense, multi-layered institution whose influence stretches farther than any king's, deeper than any guild's, and wider than any market's reach. Tonight, you walk straight into that world. You follow a street that rises gently toward the town's main church, a stone structure, Not enormous like the cathedrals that will dominate Europe in a century or two, but still imposing. Someone clearly put pride, devotion, and slightly questionable architectural math into its construction. You step through the arched doorway, and the space opens around you, cool, tall, echoing. Candles flicker along the walls, their flames bending in tiny breaths of air. Statues watch silently from alcoves, eyes carved with expressions that look both serene and mildly judgmental. A handful of townsfolk kneel in quiet prayer. A priest moves near the altar, whispering something you can't quite hear over the creaking floorboards. A mainstream historical fact drifts up as you take a seat near the back. By the 13th century, the church in Europe wielded enormous power. Not just spiritual authority, but political, economic, legal, and cultural influence. Bishops governed territories, monasteries owned land, church courts handled disputes, priests mediated marriages, inheritance, morality, and community conflicts. Faith wasn't a separate category of life. Faith was life's operating system. A flicker of movement draws your eye. A young priest hurries across the nave, balancing a stack of parchment. He looks exhausted and slightly powdered with incense, and when he catches you watching, he offers a tired half smile. Busy day? You ask quietly. Every day, he sighs. Confessions, baptisms, disputes over goats, disputes over who owns the goats, disputes about whether the goats are possessed. He trails off. People are very concerned about goats. You nod empathetically. Medieval Europe truly contains multitudes. Outside again, you follow the priest toward a side building the rectory, where several local clerics gather around a wooden table. Papers lie everywhere. One scribe is drafting a letter to the bishop. Another is trying to decipher someone's handwriting from earlier and muttering, "Is this Latin? Is this supposed to be Latin? Am I losing my mind?" Historians still argue whether medieval clergy were more educated than the lay population, or simply trained in very specific competencies. Watching this poor man squint at the parchment, you suspect both. You linger as they discuss incoming orders from the diocese, including repairs to the church roof again, an upcoming feast day procession, new guidelines about what counts as acceptable singing volume, a reminder that relic authenticity must be verified, which earns a collective night. A quirky tidbit emerges when an older priest explains that last week someone claimed to have a toenail of Saint Martin, but it turned out to be a piece of old bone from a pig. They confiscated it, blessed the owner for good intentions, and fed the bone to an actual pig to restore cosmic balance. You're not sure the church officially endorses pig-based relic recycling, but no one seems concerned. You follow the clerics as they head back out into the town. Night is fully settled now. Torches cast wavering light along the stone walls. A cool breeze rustles tunics and cloaks. People step aside, respectfully, when priests pass, bowing heads, touching foreheads, making the sign of the cross. Authority follows the clergy like a second shadow. You wander with them through the square. At a well, two women argue loudly about whose turn it is to draw water. The priest steps in, listens patiently, then resolves the argument with surprising skill. You realize, religious figures here aren't just spiritual leaders. They're mediators, counselors, teachers, news-bearers, and in some cases, the closest thing the town has to therapists. A man rushes up carrying a crying child, pleading for a blessing to stop the fever. The priest kneels, murmurs a prayer, then hands the family instructions for an herbal remedy. The father bows deeply. You feel the weight of expectation placed on clergy. Every problem, every ailment, every fear brought to their doorstep. At the edge of the square, you witness something more formal, a church court session. A small crowd gathers as a cleric, acting as judge, hears a minor dispute. A baker is accused of selling loaves lighter than the weight required. He swears it was the humidity. His accuser swears he's a liar. Someone mentions the devil. Someone else suggests testing the loaf by placing it in holy water. The judge sighs deeply. Historians still argue whether church courts were fairer than secular courts, or simply different varieties of confusing. Judging from the expressions around you, neither system is simple. As the crowd disperses, you walk with one of the clerics along a quiet lane. He talks softly about his studies, scripture, philosophy, canon law, and about the pressure that comes with serving both God and community. You carry their grief, he says, their sins, their hopes, their fears, and sometimes their chickens, he sighs. People keep giving me chickens. You almost laugh, but his expression is sincere. Finally, you approach the edge of town, where the silhouette of a larger church looms against the stars. Construction has begun, a high stone frame rising slowly, surrounded by scaffolding. Masons and carpenters will work on this for decades, perhaps even centuries, all for a building meant to touch heaven. The cleric gazes at it with quiet pride. The world changes, he murmurs. Kings rise, towns grow, wars burn. But the church, he gestures upward, we endure. You look at the skeletal structure, massive stones stacked by candlelight, wooden beams reaching skyward like arms in prayer, and you feel it too. The immensity of medieval faith, stretching across every border, settlement, and century. The church at full strength isn't just a building, a ritual, or a set of rules. It's the spine of medieval Europe, supporting, shaping, dividing, uniting, comforting, controlling. You take a deep breath of cool night air and step away, guided onward by the soft tolling of a distant bell. Morning seeps gently over the rooftops of the town, and you find yourself following a thin stream of students and clerics toward a place you've only heard whispered about in the past few days. A place where minds sharpen like blades and manuscripts multiply like rabbits. As the road curves, you see it, a cluster of stone buildings surrounding a central courtyard, their windows tall and narrow, their doors plastered with notices written in cramped Latin. You've reached the university, or, more accurately, one of the earliest versions of such a place. A place where Europe is rediscovering knowledge, stitching together ancient ideas with new curiosity, and arguing loudly about everything. You step through the arched entryway, and immediately, the air feels different, crisp, charged. A mix of ink, parchment dust, and unwashed students, a scent historians would politely describe as scholarly. A mainstream historical fact settles in. By the 12th and 13th centuries, universities were forming across Europe, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, Salamanca centers of learning built around guilds, charters, and an unquenchable hunger for knowledge. They taught theology, law, medicine, arithmetic, astronomy, philosophy, rhetoric, basically everything, except how to manage time or deal with stress, skills students clearly still needed. You follow two young men debating furiously in Latin as they walk. At first it sounds profound. Then you realize they're arguing about whether Aristotle meant substance, metaphorically or literally, and also which tavern sells the cheapest ale. The medieval multitasking is impressive. Inside the courtyard, dozens of students gather in small clusters. Some clutch books to their chests like they're priceless, which they are, given that each one was copied by hand with the patience of a saint. Others scribble notes on wax tablets, their styluses tapping in rapid bursts. A few lounge under trees, reciting lines from memory in a half-dramatic, half-exhausted monotone. One young scholar approaches you, pushes up, his slightly crooked cap, and asks, "Do you know where Master Roland is lecturing today? Theology? Law? Moral philosophy?" His schedule is flexible. You shrug. His sigh suggests this is not the answer he hoped for. You slip into a classroom, meaning a dim hall with stone walls, no desks, straw on the floor, and an entire vibe of good luck paying attention. Students sit on wooden benches arranged in haphazard rows. At the front stands a master in a dark robe, reading from a thick manuscript. He clears his throat. As Aristotle writes, he begins, "A thing must be known by its cause, and a cause must be understood in relation to its form." A student in the back immediately falls asleep. Another elbows him awake. You sympathize deeply. Medieval lectures appear to have the same effect as modern ones. The master continues, occasionally pausing to glare at anyone whispering. His assistant stands nearby, ready to swat inattentive students with a long stick. The stick is labeled persuasion. You assume this is meant to be ironic. Historians still argue whether medieval students were more studious or more chaotic than their modern counterparts. Based on the whispers, doodles, and a near fistfight over whose turn it is to borrow a quill, you suspect chaos wins by a landslide. When the lecture ends, the hallway erupts in chatter. Students flood outside, stretching stiff limbs and complaining loudly about the price of parchment, how impossible it is to memorize canon law, the rumor that someone stole a manuscript from the library, the dining hall, serving gruel 3 nights in a row, the philosopher who teaches everything in brie, riddles, for no clear reason. A quirky tidbit drops into your lap when two students mention a debate club that meets behind the stables because their discussions get too heated. Last week, someone got so passionately confused about Plato's cave that he accidentally kicked over a lantern. Fortunately, the fire was small. Unfortunately, the smell still lingers. You make your way toward the dormitory, dark, wooden, overstuffed with students, and absolutely echoing with arguments. One door slams open, and a disheveled young man emerges carrying a stack of manuscripts, muttering, "I swear, if he quotes Augustine at me one more time, I'll..." He glances at you. "Oh, hi," then disappears down the stairs. Outside, the sun climbs higher, birds chirp, a donkey brays in the distance. Students bustle past you, carrying books, scrolls, ink pots, or in one case, an entire pigeon in a cage. For science, apparently. You follow the sound of animated debate to the philosophy yard, where a master stands under a tree, surrounded by eager pupils. He's discussing the nature of the soul, gesturing dramatically with his hands while the students lean forward as though the secrets of the universe might spill from his sleeves. One interrupts with a question. Another interrupts the interruption. Soon, 5 people are talking at once. The master raises a hand for silence, then declares, "Historians will still argue about this issue centuries from now." He smiles smugly. You suspect he's right, and possibly psychic. You drift toward the university library, if library can be used to describe a room with a dozen shelves and maybe 50 books. A clerk sits inside, guarding the manuscripts like a mother hen. When you ask if you can browse, he raises one eyebrow slowly, dramatically, and whispers, "You may look, but you may not touch." You nod solemnly. The manuscripts are treasures, copied works of ancient Greek philosophers, crumbling volumes of canon law, medical treatises filled with diagrams of organs that look suspiciously like potatoes. You lean closer to one. A map of the known world, drawn with confident inaccuracy. Europe looks like a lopsided boot. Asia resembles a surprised turtle. Africa is simply too small to be believable. You love it. As midday approaches, the bell rings for disputations, formal debates where students defend arguments like their lives depend on it. You decide to watch. The disputation hall is packed. 2 students stand at the center, each holding notes. A master steps forward and announces the topic. Resolved. The human will is free, or absolutely not free at all. The audience erupts. One student immediately shouts, "Free!" Another shouts, "Not free!" A third shouts, "I don't understand the question." Pandemonium. You sit at the back, trying to follow the arguments. One debater cites Augustine, the other cites Aristotle. Someone references a very questionable dream he once had. The master mediates with the weariness of someone who regrets his life choices. Historians still argue whether medieval scholasticism advanced intellectual thought or buried it under layers of excessive logic. Watching this dispute, you decide both are probably true at once. Evening falls, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Students gather in clusters under lantern light, still debating everything from theology to the correct number of angels who can dance on a pinhead. Someone strums a lute, someone argues with the lute player, someone else nods off on a bench. You take one last walk through the university grounds, the hum of ideas swirling around you, messy, passionate, contradictory, alive. Here, in this blossoming world of learning, medieval Europe isn't just copying old knowledge, it's rethinking it, challenging it, stitching it into something new. You slip quietly out the gate, leaving behind the sound of yet another argument about whether Aristotle ever laughed, which, according to the group near the door, remains a hotly contested scholarly debate. You leave the university at dusk, the echoes of heated debates still drifting behind you like intellectual smoke. The air cools as you follow the road out of town, where fields stretch into soft darkness and fireflies blink like tiny, confused scholars trying to take notes in the dark. Your path winds toward a low ridge, and as you crest it, you hear the rhythmic thump of marching feet, the metallic rattle of armor, and the unmistakable whip-crack of bowstrings being tested. You've walked straight into a military encampment. Not the spiritual frenzy of the Crusader camp you visited earlier, but something more grounded, more technical. This is the medieval army evolving, adapting to new tactics, new tools, new threats. As you approach, torches flare in the evening wind, casting the camp in shifting shadows that dance across mail, leather, and steel. A line of soldiers practices with pikes, forming neat, bristling hedges of spear points. Nearby, A handful of men are hunched over a long wooden box, assembling something with intense focus. One gestures you closer, wiping sweat from his brow. "A crossbow," he says proudly, lifting the weapon. "New make, strong enough to punch through. Armor." He says this very casually, as though discussing a new type of gardening tool. A mainstream historical fact hums in your thoughts. By the 12th and 13th centuries, European warfare was transforming. Longbows, crossbows, pike formations, improved armor, and increasingly organized infantry were reshaping the battlefield. Knights still dominated, but they were no longer unstoppable. Technology and tactics were catching up and fast. You watch as a longbowman steps forward, tall and wiry, arms like ropes after years of training. He nocks an arrow, draws back the bowstring with a motion that looks effortless but absolutely isn't, and releases. The arrow whistles through the air and thuds into a wooden target with surgical precision. The archer grins. "Good wind tonight." Another archer beside him mutters, "Show off." You pick up a discarded bowstring and immediately understand that medieval longbowmen were a different species of human. Your arms ache just thinking about using one. A clatter of hooves draws your attention toward the cavalry line. Knights tighten saddle straps, check stirrups, and adjust armor plates. Horses snort and stamp, aware that these drills mean heavy work. One knight attempts to mount but misjudges his own weight and nearly slides off the far side before catching himself. A squire sighs loudly, "Sir, please stop doing that." The knight clears his throat and pretends nothing happened. Nearby, a group of foot soldiers run shield drills, banging wooden shields together in rhythm as their captain shouts instructions. The shields look heavy enough to break your wrist just by considering lifting one. A younger recruit drops his shield with a loud clonk, blushes, and scoops it up again while everyone pretends not to notice out of mercy. Historians still argue whether medieval soldiers were highly trained professionals or hastily gathered villagers armed with whatever they could find. Walking through this camp, you see both. Hardened veterans next to nervous recruits, master archers next to men who still haven't figured out which end of a halberd is the business end. You wander to the far edge of camp, where a siege engineer examines a pile of wooden beams and ropes. He squints at you through soot-smeared goggles that make him look like a time-traveling librarian. "Trebuchet parts," he says proudly. "Big one. Throws rocks the size of cows." You blink. "Cows?" "Well, small cows." His assistant nods solemnly, confirming the existence of cow-sized rocks. A quirky tidbit emerges as he rummages through a pouch and pulls out a tiny carved charm. "For luck," he explains. "Best to have it when you're standing near a machine designed to throw very large things very far." Fair point. A horn sounds suddenly low, commanding. The soldiers gather quickly in ranks. A commander steps forward, tall and severe, armored but with an academic air, as though he reads strategy scrolls in. "Bed." He points toward a distant hill. "Simulated assault," he calls. "Archers first, then pikes, then cavalry. No injuries this time." Several men groan quietly at the no injuries rule, which suggests last time was spirited. The drill begins. Archers move to the front, releasing volleys in graceful arcs. The pikes advance in tight squares, their points gleaming like a metal sea urchin. Then the cavalry charges a thunderous wave of hooves and armor that vibrates through the ground. It's chaotic, loud, and surprisingly coordinated. You watch the mock battle play out. There's a rhythm to it. Attack, retreat, regroup, strike again. Dust rises in swirling clouds. Horses rear, soldiers shout. Commanders bark orders that somehow make sense, despite sounding like cryptic poetry. And beneath it all, you sense the shift. Medieval warfare isn't just individual valor anymore. It's teamwork, formations, discipline, timing. Even knights are beginning to realize they can't just charge alone into the sunset and expect everyone else to collapse politely. As the drill ends, the soldiers break formation. Some laugh, some collapse onto the grass, others immediately begin polishing armor or repairing gear. A few wander toward the cook fires, because nothing builds an appetite like simulated violence. You approach the longbowman again. One hands you an arrow. "Feel the weight," he says. You do. It's heavier than you expected, the shaft smooth, the fletching soft. He gestures for you to keep it. Souvenir. So you remember not to stand in front of one. Wise advice. Night settles over the camp. Fires brighten, flickering against helmets and shields. Men gather around stew pots, bowls in hand. A group of soldiers near you begin singing a rough, off-key marching song about ale, mud, and someone named Old One-Eyed Thomas, who apparently slept through an entire battle. You sit beside them, accepting a bowl of stew handed your way. It tastes mostly of beans, salt, and ambition. Steam rises into the cool air. As they eat, the soldiers talk about home, fear, pride, bruises from training, rumors of distant battles, the hope of plunder, the dread of arrows, the comfort of comradeship. One man pokes the fire and says, "War's changing, faster than any of us can keep up." Another nods slowly. "Feels like the world's shifting under our boots." Historians still argue whether this period marked the birth of modern warfare or simply the messy transition between eras. Sitting here, surrounded by longbows, crossbows, pikes, horses, and half-built siege engines, you feel it clearly. Medieval Europe is learning new ways to fight, new ways to win, new ways to fear. You finish your stew, hand back the bowl, and step away from the fire. Behind you, the camp glows with torchlight and determination. Ahead of you, the night waits quiet, dark, unknowingly holding the next transformation of a world in motion. You walk on, arrow in hand, into the deepening medieval night. You leave the military encampment behind as night settles fully over the land, the glow of the soldiers' fires shrinking to tiny sparks in the distance. The air turns cooler, quieter, too quiet. Even the insects seem hesitant to sing. You follow a narrow road that snakes between dark fields, and as dawn begins to creep over the horizon, the landscape blurs with a sort of heavy stillness. Something is different. You step into a small village just as the sun rises, but instead of the usual clatter of morning life buckets scraping at the well, roosters screaming, children racing barefoot through the dust, you find an eerie hush. Doors are shut, windows shuttered, a thin wisp of smoke curls from a single chimney, but even that seems reluctant. A dog trots across the road, ribs visible, tail low. It glances at you before disappearing between two houses. You swallow, suddenly aware of how loud your footsteps sound. You approach the village green, where a handful of people gather in, tight knots, whispering urgently. One woman clutches a rosary with white knuckles. A man scrubs his hands over and over in a bucket of cold water, as if trying to wash something off that won't leave. A voice calls out sharply, "Don't get too close." You freeze. A priest steps forward, sleeves rolled down, face drawn with exhaustion. He looks you over, sighs, and gestures for you to stay at a distance. The lines on his face tell you he hasn't slept in days. "There's illness here," he says quietly. "Bad illness." You nod slowly. You already know which illness. You feel it like a heaviness in your bones. The plague. A mainstream historical fact flickers in your mind. Europe suffered waves of plague long before the infamous 14th century outbreak, but when that wave hit the Black Death, it tore through the continent with unimaginable speed. Between 1347 and 1352, tens of millions died. Cities emptied, fields rotted, entire villages vanished. The world's structure, economic, social, spiritual, strained under the weight of loss. This village is trapped somewhere in that devastation. You watch quietly as a cart rolls past, its wheels creaking, carrying two still forms wrapped in coarse shrouds. A man walks beside it, head bowed, tears carving lines down his dirt-streaked cheeks. He doesn't look at you. He can't. A group of villagers stand near a boarded-up house. Someone inside coughs a dry, rattling sound that twists your stomach. A woman outside holds her hands to the door, whispering through the wood. "I'm here. I'm right here." Her voice breaks. Historians still argue whether people truly believed the plague was divine punishment, bad air, poisoned wells, or planetary misalignment. But in moments like this, explanations don't matter. Fear is its own truth. You step closer carefully to a well, where a man wearing a tattered hood stirs a pot of herbs. He notices the look on your face. "Charm against the sickness," he explains. "Sage, rosemary, juniper, boiled until the scent fills the house." He lowers his voice. "My grandmother swears it works. You try to smile. You can't." Nearby, a group of children sit silently on a bench. No chatter, no games. One clutches a small wooden toy, a knight with a painted shield. The child stares at the ground as though it might answer a question no one dares ask. You keep walking, feet heavy. At the edge of the village, a man wearing a leather mask adjusts the herbs stuffed inside its beak-shaped nose. You blink, surprised. The mask looks like the famous plague doctor costume, but rougher, simpler, early, improvised. He carries a staff to keep distance from the sick. He stops when he sees you. "You're not from here," he says. "No," you whisper. "Then keep moving." The sickness doesn't care who you are. A dog barks suddenly. Everyone flinches. Everyone looks tired of flinching. You turn down a narrow lane. Outside a house, a bucket of water sits with a cloth soaked in vinegar. A woman gently wipes her husband's forehead, speaking to him in a soft voice. He doesn't respond. She doesn't cry. She probably ran out of tears days ago. A quirky tidbit surfaces unexpectedly when you overhear two men arguing in hushed tones. "It isn't plague," one insists. "It is plague," the other snaps. "How do you know?" "Because if it wasn't, I wouldn't be afraid, would I?" It's grim, but the logic is painfully honest. In a corner of the square, a monk kneels beside a makeshift altar set with candles, some flickering, some already burned low. He prays aloud, voice trembling but steady. "Protect this village. Protect those who remain. Give rest to those who've gone." A crowd stands behind him, eyes closed, hands clasped, breaths shaky. You stand among them, feeling the weight of grief press in from all sides. As the monk finishes, a cry echoes from a shack near the mill. A woman staggers out, face contorted, collapsing onto her knees. Several villagers rush to her. Someone whispers, "Another one." The priest earlier told you to stay away, but you step forward instinctively only to feel a firm hand on your arm. An older woman shakes her head. "Help in other ways," she says softly. "Not this one." You step back. The sun climbs higher, but the village remains dim, its spirit muffled under the shroud of sickness. Even the birds seem hesitant to sing. You find a spot near a fence and watch the landscape fields stretching outward, forests beyond, a river winding in the distance. Beautiful, peaceful, indifferent. Historians still argue about the exact number of lives lost. Whether it was 1/3 of Europe, half, even more in certain regions. The numbers blur, because numbers can't capture the feeling you're standing in now, the silence, the fear, the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, the next sunrise will bring reprieve. As evening falls, villagers light candles in their windows, tiny flickers of defiance against the dark. You watch them glow one by one, until the whole village looks like a constellation resting on the earth. You stand quietly, letting the scene settle in your chest. Medieval Europe has shown you its strength, its order, its growth, and now it shows you its fragility. You step away slowly, leaving the village behind, your footsteps soft, careful, as though afraid to disturb the balance between sorrow and survival. You walk away from the plague-stricken village, long after the lights in the windows have dimmed, long after the priest's final prayer fades into the night. The road feels heavier beneath your feet now, each step landing in the quiet aftermath of what you just witnessed. The land itself seems to exhale slowly, like it's carrying a weight too old, too deep, to ever fully release. But the world does not stay silent forever. A few days later, after miles of lonely paths and scattered farmsteads, you approach another village, this one very much alive and very much loud. Before you even enter, you hear shouting. Not angry shouting, convincing shouting, passionate shouting. The kind of shouting that suggests people have been unhappy long enough to start doing something about it. You step into the square, and there they are. Peasants gathered in a tight cluster, some standing on carts, others waving sticks. A few holding tools like hoes and pitchforks, not exactly weapons, but close enough if you squint. They're not rioting yet, but the tension buzzes like static. A young man barely 20 stands on a barrel, gesturing wildly as he speaks. "And if the Lord raises rents again," he declares, "we'll have to sell everything, even the chickens." And the chickens refuse to go. You blink. That last part may not be entirely metaphorical. A mainstream historical fact unfurls in your mind. Medieval Europe experienced waves of uprisings, small ones, large ones, some peaceful, many violent. The Jacquerie in France, the Peasants' Revolt in England, dozens more, sparked by taxes, hunger, war, plague, bad harvests, legal oppression, or accumulated frustration. The social fabric often stretched thin and sometimes snapped. Historians still argue whether these uprisings were spontaneous or carefully organized, desperate explosions or early political movements. Judging from the energy here, it's an explosive mixture of all of those. You move closer and notice the signs of strain. Houses worn thin by years of hardship. Fields that produced less this season than last. Families who've buried too many loved ones. Tax collectors who visited just yesterday. You hear it in the mutters. No more forced labor. No more taxes for wars we didn't choose. No more grain taken before our own children eat. The young speaker continues, fired up. The Lord owns everything, they say. The land, the fields, the forests. Rivers, why? Because someone we've never met said so. The crowd murmurs approval. An older woman steps forward, raising her chin. My husband works 3 days for the Lord. 3. Then our own fields suffer. What justice is that? You feel the growing heat beneath their frustration, anger, sharpened by grief, sharpened by hunger, sharpened by the sense that they've carried the weight of the world for centuries and finally want to put it down. A quirky tidbit surfaces as one elderly man waves a wooden spoon in the air. And another thing, he yells. I heard the Lord's pigs got fresh oats last week. Oats? My pigs haven't seen oats since the last king. The crowd gasps in shared outrage. Pigs eating luxury rations? Unthinkable. Just then, a church bell rings not for prayer, but as a warning. Heads turn. The reeve and 2 guards approach from the manor's direction. The guards don't look menacing, more like men who woke up hoping for a peaceful day and are now deeply regretting their career choices. What's all this? The reeve demands. The crowd parts slightly, but not in retreat, more like the ripple before a wave. The young speaker answers carefully. We want a meeting with the Lord. Today. The reeve stares at him as though he'd just asked the sky to come down and bake him bread. The Lord doesn't take, then he should start. Someone calls from the back. The guards shift uneasily. You stand at the edge of the square, watching the delicate balance unfold. This is how revolts begin. Not with torches or mobs, but with tired voices finally refusing to bend. Not rage, but resolve. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants were powerless or surprisingly assertive. Moments like this prove they could be both crushed by circumstance, yet fierce when pushed past endurance. The reeve raises his hands. Fine, he snaps. Fine, I will ask the Lord. He storms off, guards trailing behind him like reluctant ducks. The peasants exhale, tension loosening but not disappearing. A few sit on crates, others cluster in hushed conversation. The young speaker hops down from the barrel, wiping sweat from his brow. A woman pats his arm. You spoke well. I spoke loudly, he mutters. Same thing, she replies. You drift among the villagers, hearing fragments of fear and hope. Do you think he'll listen? He never listens. Maybe this time he must. What if he sends soldiers? We'll run. We won't. We can't. You sense the fragility of the moment. It could tip toward negotiation, or collapse into chaos. Eventually, the reeve returns. Alone, the Lord will meet you, he announces. The crowd erupts, some relieved, some suspicious. You walk with them toward the manor, staying at the edge. The Lord stands before his hall, arms folded, expression taut. This is not a man used to being confronted by his own tenants. The meeting begins. You can't hear everything from where you stand, but you see, hands shaking, voices rising, the Lord frowning, the speaker standing firm, the older woman pointing her finger with fearless precision. After a long, heated exchange, the Lord finally raises his hand. Enough, he says. Rents will not increase this year. The crowd exhales like a single body. And labor obligations will be reviewed, he adds reluctantly. A cheer rises. It isn't revolution. It isn't the end of feudalism. But it's a victory, small, temporary, fragile, yes, but real. And in a world that has given these people little to celebrate, even a small victory feels like reclaiming breath after drowning. As the crowd disperses, the young speaker sinks onto a bench. Exhausted, you sit beside him silently. We didn't change the world, he says. No, you reply. But you changed today. He smiles a tired, hopeful smile. The sun sets behind the manor, painting the sky with streaks of gold and ember. And as you rise to continue your journey, You realize something stirring quietly across medieval Europe. People are beginning to question, to push, to challenge, to rise. Not all at once, not everywhere, but enough that the ground beneath your feet feels just a little looser. You walk onward, into a world slowly awakening to its own voice. You leave the village behind as the sun slides toward a warm, amber afternoon, bathing the fields in a long golden glow. Birds circle lazily overhead. The air smells faintly of dust and ripening grain, and for the first time in several days, the silence around you isn't heavy. It's calm, open, even hopeful, and then the road widens, curving toward a slow-moving river. A cluster of wooden boats bob at the bank, ropes tied to posts, sails furled, cargo stacked neatly on the shore. You hear chatter light, excited chatter mixed with the creak of timber and the slap of water. Travelers, traders, wanderers, and among them, explorers. You come closer and see a group preparing one of the larger riverboats for departure packing. Wool sacks, crates of pottery, barrels stamped with foreign symbols, and bundles wrapped in tarred cloth. The air buzzes with anticipation, the same way it did in guild halls and universities, but sharpened now by the thrill of the unknown. A tall man with wind-ruffled hair and a sun-cracked smile waves you over. "You headed downriver?" he asks. "Not sure yet," you admit. He shrugs. "Neither are we. That's half the fun." A quirky tidbit already medieval explorers frequently set out, with only a partial plan, trusting the river, luck, or divine providence to fill in the details. Historians still argue whether this was bravery or extremely fancy wandering. You linger as the crew continues loading. You notice their tools, not swords, not armor, but ropes, hooks, rolled maps, weighted measuring cords, and a strange bronze device with a sliding arm. An astrolabe, the tall man explains when he sees your confusion. "Bought it from a scholar who claimed it could tell me the secrets of the heavens." "Does it?" you ask. He leans close. "No idea. Haven't figured out how to use it." He laughs, but there's real affection in the gesture. Medieval Europe is rediscovering the world, one confused astrolabe at a time. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. By the 13th and 14th centuries, curiosity about distant lands grew rapidly. Merchants travelled farther. Seafaring improved, maps expanded, rumours of strange kingdoms, new trade routes, and unimaginable riches stirred imaginations. The Silk Road, the African kingdoms, the Norse voyages, and whispered tales of Cathay all fed a growing desire to look beyond Europe's familiar horizons. You notice a man sitting on a crate nearby, scribbling notes furiously into a small book. He pauses to sketch poorly a bird flying overhead. When he realizes you're watching, he blushes. "Natural. Studies," he mumbles. "Master at the university said we should record things the way they are, not the way we assume they are." He shows you a previous page. It contains what you think is meant to be a squirrel, but resembles a confused potato with a tail. You smile encouragingly. He beams. You wander toward a merchant, supervising the loading of jars sealed with wax. When you ask what they contain, he taps one proudly. "Honey, bought in the valley. Taking it east, where honey is worth triple." "Anything else?" you ask. He grins. "Rumors, whispers, stories of lands with spices that burn like fire and seas that glitter like silver. If those are true," he lowers his voice, "we might be rich. Or dead." But medieval optimism is a powerful force. Further down the riverbank, you find a group huddled around a parchment map weighted by stones. It doesn't resemble any map you've seen before. Coastlines curly and exaggerated, forests drawn as clusters of triangles, mountains represented by tiny, suspiciously sharp humps. A man points at a distant region. "Here, that's where we'll go next. They say merchants there trade in gems the size of eggs." Another man scoffs. "They also said there were men with dog heads last time." "How'd that turn out?" The first shrugs, still sorting truth from embellishment. Historians still argue whether medieval travellers believed the fantastical stories they carried, or simply used them as medieval clickbait for attention. Probably both. You wander closer to the river, where a pair of fishermen repair nets. One of them nods toward the explorers. "Every year," he says, "more of them chase the edges of the map. They return with things I can't pronounce, and stories I don't believe." "Do you want to go?" you ask. He snorts. "No. I like knowing where my bed is." He pauses. but I like hearing the stories. You sit with that thought for a moment. As the crew finishes loading the boat, people gather to say their goodbyes, some cheerful, some tearful. A woman embraces her husband, slipping a cloth bundle into his bag. A group of children wave wooden toy boats carved by the village carpenter. One man steps aboard, turns to the crowd, and declares loudly, "If I find a kingdom made entirely of gold, I shall send word." Someone yells back, "And if you don't come back, we'll know the gold killed you." Laughter ripples through the crowd. Humor, the oldest life raft. You watch as the boat finally pushes off. The river current catches it gently, pulling it downstream. The explorers wave, the villagers cheer, the water glitters in the afternoon sun. The vessel grows smaller and smaller until it's just a dark shape slipping between the reeds. And you stand there, feeling the strange mix of longing and comfort that comes with watching people embark on journeys you're not taking. After the boat vanishes, a hush settles. The river flows on. Birds skim low, over the surface. Someone behind you sighs softly. Medieval Europe, once inward, fractured, isolated, is beginning to stretch outward. Trade routes widen, curiosity sharpens, maps expand. The world feels bigger now, richer, more uncertain. You follow the riverbank upstream. A group of young boys practice skipping stones poorly. An old woman sits on a stump, telling a traveler that she heard there's a land where the mountains glow red at night. The traveler nods politely, clearly unsure if this is geography or poetry. Evening approaches. The sky turns a soft lavender, brushed with streaks of rose. You walk along the water, listening to its steady murmur, feeling the pull of the horizon. For centuries, Europe was a world defined by boundaries, lords' lands, village fields, forest edges, castle walls. But now, slowly, steadily, people are looking beyond those boundaries. You stop at the crest of a small hill and watch the river vanish into the deepening dusk, a path toward unknown worlds. Exploration doesn't begin with ships or caravans. It begins with wonder, with whispers, with ordinary people believing the world might be larger than they were told. And in this moment, under the dimming sky, you feel it too. You follow the riverbank until the water widens into a broad, shimmering bend, its surface catching the last threads of sunset. The sky above glows in deep layers of violet and ember, as if the day is reluctantly releasing its grip on the world. And as you walk, the murmur of the river mixes with another sound, soft hammering, murmured voices, the scrape of chisels. You're approaching a town unlike the others you've visited so far, not louder, not bigger, but different. There's a brightness here, a kind of restless creativity humming in the streets. Renaissance light is arriving quietly, slowly, like dawn creeping over a horizon it hasn't quite claimed yet. The town's gate is open, guarded by a single soldier slumped against the wall, yawning deeply. He waves you in with the energy of someone who has decided that vigilance is overrated. Inside, you find bustling workshops lit by oil lamps, their windows glowing like little golden lanterns. Students and apprentices hurry between buildings with bundles of scrolls, tools, or sketchboards under their arms. You pause outside a workshop where a young man leans over a wooden table, drawing with charcoal. He stops occasionally to squint at an apple sitting in the center of the table like a royal guest. When he sees you watching, he beams proudly. "Trying to draw it exactly as it is," he says. "Not as the old masters said it should look." You tilt your head. "And how's that going?" He holds up the sketch. You stare. It is surprisingly excellent. The apple looks real enough to pick up, real enough to bite, real enough that you're suddenly awkwardly aware of how mediocre your own stick figure skills are. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. In the late medieval era, the seeds of the Renaissance begin to sprout in countless small ways. Improved craft techniques, rediscovered manuscripts from the ancient world, better access to education, contact with other cultures through trade and travel. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Paris become hubs of thought, art, and innovation. But the transformation doesn't happen in a single moment or place. It flickers into being across Europe, piece by piece. You walk further and find a small courtyard where artisans carve stone panels. One sculptor chips away at a slab, shaping a face that looks startlingly human, not stylized, not symbolic, but expressive. He pauses to brush dust from the eyes he's carving. "Trying to capture emotion," he explains, "not just form." He leans closer to whisper conspiratorially, "My master says this is dangerous." too lifelike, too bold. But what's the point of carving a face if it doesn't look back at you? Historically, many artists did push boundaries, and many masters did panic about it. Historians still argue whether early Renaissance artists saw themselves as rebels or simply craftsmen following curiosity wherever it led. You continue down the street and find a tavern that's somehow louder inside than out. You slip through the door and discover a packed room of scholars, merchants, artists, and wandering thinkers. Half the tables are covered in parchment, the other half are filled with cups of wine and ale. The debates happening here sound like academic duels fought with words instead of swords. One man stands on a chair, shouting over the crowd, "I tell you, the world is round." Someone else shouts back, "Yes, yes, everyone knows that now, sit down." A third man rises and waves a parchment map in the air. "This is the new map," he announces. "More accurate, flatter coasts, fewer dragons." The tavern applauds. You take a seat at a quieter table where two scholars argue in hushed intensity. "The ancients knew much," one says, "but they didn't know everything." The other nods. "Which is why we must question them. Study them, yes, but surpass them." You can feel it in their voices, the shift from reverence to curiosity, from repetition to reinvention. A quirky tidbit emerges when a man beside you leans over and whispers, "There's a painter in this town who mixes crushed eggshells into his pigments because he swears it makes colors last longer." You blink. Does it work? "No idea," he shrugs. "But his paintings do look crunchy." You leave the tavern as laughter bursts behind you, floating out into the night air like sparks from a fire. Outside, the streets are quieter, the lamps glowing softly. You pass a small print shop, an invention still new to Europe. Through the window you see sheets of text drying on strings, the smell of ink heavy and pioneering. A young printer steps out carrying a stack of pages. He bumps into you and nearly drops them. "Sorry," he gasps. "I'm making copies of a medical treatise. People say the printed word spreads faster than gossip." He grins. "Imagine a world where anyone can own a book." You smile back. It sounds revolutionary. "Oh, it will be," he says with wide eyes. "It will change everything." Historians still argue whether the printing press is the single greatest catalyst of the Renaissance or simply one tool among many. But everyone agrees. Once ideas can travel faster than horses, the world changes. You wander toward the town square, where a crowd gathers around a man standing beside an odd contraption made of gears, wooden rods, and weights. He cranks a handle, causing a series of levers to lift small marbles and drop them in a sequence that looks suspiciously mathematical. "What is it?" someone asks. "A demonstration of mechanical principles," the man replies, puffing out his chest. "One day, machines like this may do useful work." The crowd applauds, though you're certain none of them understands what they just witnessed. You're not entirely sure you do, but that's the spirit of the entire moment. Excitement, curiosity, half-formed ideas sloshing with potential. Europe is no longer content with old answers. A soft breeze drifts through the square, carrying the scent of night-blooming flowers and fresh parchment. Lantern light paints the buildings in long shadows that feel somehow gentler than in earlier centuries. You feel it a subtle shift, like the world is exhaling after centuries of confinement. More light, more learning, more questioning, more reaching for what lies beyond the visible. The night deepens. Artists shut their workshops. Students gather their books. Printers hang their sheets to dry. Scholars argue their way toward the tavern door. You gaze around, taking in the mosaic of inspiration and ambition glowing under the stars. This isn't the Renaissance yet, not the one historians will celebrate, but it's the tremor before the earthquake, the kindling before the fire, the whisper before the chorus. Medieval Europe is beginning to tilt slowly, beautifully, towards something brighter than it's been in centuries. And with each step you take from the square, you feel yourself crossing the soft, invisible threshold between one world and the next. You leave the early Renaissance town behind as dawn creeps over the horizon, brushing soft light across the landscape. The road stretches quiet before you, no armies marching, no guilds hammering, no scholars arguing, no plagues lurking at the edge of every breath. Just the long, hushed exhale of a continent slowly turning a page. You walk through rolling fields still wet with dew, the grass brushing your boots, the sky a pale watercolor of early morning blue. Birds call lazily from fence posts. A single cart rattles in the distance, its wheels bumping over stones with the steady rhythm of someone who's been traveling since before sunrise. For a moment, it feels like the world has slowed down, like medieval Europe itself is giving you space to understand everything you've seen. 1,000 years, 1,000 shifting rhythms, 1,000 ways people lived, worked, prayed, loved, feared, hoped, built, broke, rebuilt. And now, you're standing in the final breaths of that age. You pass by a quiet village, no uprising today, no gathering crowds, no rising tension. Just farmers tending animals, women sweeping doorways, a baker sliding bread into a clay oven. Life moves on in small circles, steady and familiar. These are the days that don't make chronicles but shape centuries all the same. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. By the late 15th century, medieval Europe edges toward transformation on every front. Monarchies centralize, towns rise, learning spreads, art shifts, exploration explodes, warfare transforms, religion stands on the brink of upheaval. It is the end of an age defined by slow change and the beginning of one defined by speed. But endings are rarely dramatic in the moment. Most often, they feel like this: a quiet morning, a soft breeze, ordinary people living ordinary days that historians will later call extraordinary. You continue along the road until it slopes upward toward a hilltop, overlooking a broad swath of countryside. When you reach the crest, the entire landscape unfurls beneath you, a patchwork of fields, towns, forests, and winding rivers, all bathed in the soft glow of a rising sun. This is medieval Europe, exhaling. You sit on a smooth stone, letting the light warm your face. The wind brushes past you, carrying faint echoes from each place you've travelled. The chanting of monks, the clatter of guild hammers, the laughter of scholars, the shouts of soldiers, the whispers of pilgrims, the cries of peasants demanding fairness, the soft prayers of plague-stricken families, the hopeful cheers of explorers pushing beyond the horizon, every sound layered into this long, living continent. Historians still argue where, exactly, the medieval era ends. Some point to the fall of Constantinople, others to the invention of the printing press, others to Columbus sailing west, others still to shifts in philosophy, politics, or the economy. But sitting here, you see the ending differently. Not a single moment, not a dramatic flourish, but a slow unfurling like a dawn that takes decades to lift, reshaping the world bit by bit. A quirky tidbit drifts through your memory. A scholar in the tavern earlier insisted the Middle Ages would be remembered as the time when people tried everything, believed everything, feared everything, and survived everything. You smile. It's not a bad summary. You stand and wander down the slope, following a small dirt track into a quiet grove. The trees are tall and old, branches arching overhead like a vaulted cathedral. Sunbeams pierce the canopy, illuminating drifting dust like tiny golden stars. You pause beside a fallen log, running your fingers along its rough bark. For a moment, the world feels suspended, like the forest itself remembers every battle, every prayer, every rebellion, every coronation, every whispered legend. 1,000 years pressed into the rings of ancient trees. Then, from somewhere through the trees, you hear a small sound, a child laughing. You follow it to a clearing where a family gathers around a tiny garden. The father waters seedlings. The mother kneels to tie her daughter's braids. The girl plays with a carved wooden horse, making it trot through the grass. It's simple. It's ordinary. It's everything. Because this quiet resilience, this steady heartbeat of daily life, is what carried medieval Europe through a millennium of upheaval. Not kings, not battles, not churches or castles or guilds, but people. People who kept living. The little girl laughs again as her toy horse trips over a stone. Her parents smile. And the world feels suddenly softer, grounded, human. You walk back toward the main road, the forest thinning until sunlight bursts through in full brightness. The path ahead glows warm and golden. Europe is changing behind you and changing ahead of you, but for this last moment, it rests in perfect stillness. You exhale. The continent exhales with you. The medieval age has reached its twilight, not with a roar, but with a long, gentle sigh. The road ahead softens as the light settles into a warm, amber haze, stretching in slow, unhurried lines across the earth. Each sound fades gently now, the distant bleating of sheep, the whisper of wind bending low grasses, the quiet creak of a cartwheel somewhere far behind you. Everything grows slow, easy, and wonderfully distant. as though the world is pulling a soft blanket over its shoulders. You take one last, easy breath of the cool air. It fills your chest without effort, drifting out again in a lengthened, calming rhythm. The sky above is no longer bright, but tender, washed in pale gold that slowly dissolves into muted lavender at the edges. Even the clouds seem to drift more lazily, stretching themselves thin across a peaceful evening. The road narrows into a gentle path, and the sounds of the past monks chanting, markets buzzing, armor clattering, scholars debating settle into the quiet soil behind you. They become warm echoes, drifting farther and farther away with every step. What remains is soft, steady, almost sleepy. A world settling into rest after a 1,000-year story. The breeze that brushes your cheek is lighter now, slower, as though the air itself is relaxing, stretching, letting go. A faint birdsong reaches you from somewhere high in the trees, gentle, unhurried, the kind of sound that wraps around your thoughts like a slow lullaby. Each breath you take lengthens naturally. Each step grows quieter. Each moment drifts into the next like pages turning themselves. The path before you glows with comforting dimness, the horizon melting into soft shadow. Nothing asks anything of you now. Nothing pulls, nothing presses. The world simply eases and invites you to ease with it. Let the last of the daylight slip away. Let your thoughts settle like dust on a still evening. And let the quiet carry you gently into rest,